Hey everybody, welcome back to Word Balloon, the comic book conversation show. John Suntress here, some memories of Dennis O'Neil on this Sunday, the weekend that we learned that Denny had passed. 81 years old, a great life, a great comic book career, a tough life, a very tortured life, frankly. Denny was a recovering alcoholic and had his demons, and a lot of those demons did come out in his stories. This is a combination of two conversations I've had with Denny over the years. My first from 2006, and my last from August of 2018. It was a pleasure to talk to Denny, and in fact, I was very pleased to have these intimate conversations with him. And there's another companion podcast that came out today, Dennis O'Neil the Man, where we discuss his autobiography, Captain Mighty and the Redemption of Danny the Kid. Semi-fictionalized, but a lot of truth in that novel that Denny wrote back in 2018. These conversations are more about the work and more about his career. And it was a pleasure to talk to him in both cases. Really all three times as far as one-on-one. And then a fourth time where I got to moderate a great panel about Robin the Boy Wonder that featured Pete Tomasi and Tim Seeley and the great Mike Barr and Denny. It was pretty amazing, and it happened at Terrificon back in August of 2018. And then we had what will be the second part of our conversation, that last talk that Denny and I had back in August of 2018. Anyhow, I want to get it started with a great anecdote from Brian Bendis about an encounter with Denny at New York Comic Con in 2006. It's a pretty great story, and it shows the character of Denny O'Neil. So listen to Bendis now as he tells that story here on Word Balloon.
What happened at the writers' panel in New York? I got shut out because I was unaware it was an advanced ticketing event, and I heard it was amazing.
It was amazing. It was one of the best panels I've ever been on. It was me, and this is back to the Tom DeFalco eating the brain question too. I guess Frank was there. It was me, Tom DeFalco, J.M. DeMatteis, Denny O'Neil, Chris Claremont, and I had not met any of these people before except for Chris Claremont, and we were just introducing ourselves, and all of a sudden Tom DeFalco, who the night before at a panel was equally shot out of a cannon, grabs the microphone and says, "I'm DeFalco, and I hate these kids today. They like comics like the radio plays. Comics aren't radio plays. They're action and explosions and drama." And I'm like, holy crap. And I could see there was a lot of guys from my board in the room, and it was a standing room only, and it was just kind of weird that he would just lay off like that.
So he was serious?
Oh yeah, he was completely serious. And then he hands the microphone to me, and I said, well, can I respond to that? And he goes, "Oh, let's talk about you." Which is pretty funny. And then I expressed, what I just expressed earlier, that I don't think there's any right or wrong way to make a comic, and I think that not enough people are pushing the medium as hard as they could, even in mainstream comics, and in fact, especially in mainstream comics. Maybe it's our obligation to go further with it and to try stuff, and maybe you'll fall on your butt. Maybe you'll do 12 pages of pinups and someone will want to kill you, but at least you're trying new things.
Sure.
That are story related, and I really think that I think about all the comics that I love. They're always been comics that at least tried something new, and I really think that's magical. But at the same time, the traditions of the medium, the traditions of Marvel Comics, and traditions of mainstream comics are important, and if people want to express their comics that way, great. But I just don't see why someone would get bent out of shape about someone trying something new. And that was nice. And then Denny O'Neil asked for the microphone. I'm like, oh boy, because he's a very elderly man, and I thought he's just gonna hammer me, right? And he grabs the microphone and he goes, "Let me tell you something. When I wrote Green Arrow Black in 1960, blah, 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 people said to me, that's not how you write a comic book. That's not how you write a comic book." And I would look at them going, "What? I'm just trying to write a comic book." And I'm telling you there, Tom, I'm telling you right now, there's that kid sitting over there, and I'm a kid, I'm 38 years old. There's a kid over there, and he's saying, he's making comic, and there's people here, they're buying that comic, and that comic's a hit comic, and you're sitting there, and you're going, "I don't know why, but you're too old. You're too old to be making comics, and you should leave." And I was like, whoa, and the place went nuts.
That's awesome.
And it was great. It was like the first 5 minutes of the panel. I mean, we didn't start yet. It was crazy, and I was just so grateful that someone who I admire so much wasn't going to hammer my face, because it didn't have to happen before. And so, yeah. the whole weekend, all I heard from people was like, that was an awesome panel. And I generally was thrilled because sometimes you go to those panels and it's just like paint drying.
Sure.
No one's fault of your own. Everyone's just trying to be respectful. But I love talking about this, and I love it was good theater. People were going crazy.
So now let's go back to 2006. Denny had released a novel called Helltown, which was really taking the first 20 or so issues of The Question and turning them into novel form. It was fantastic. It was gritty, just like the series was that he did with Dennis Cowan. And it was my first attempt to have a conversation with Denny. We talk about the beginnings of his career. We get into other heroes as well, but primarily it was about The Question. So from 2006, my first conversation with Dennis O'Neil on Word Balloon.
Welcome back to WordBalloon.com. This is John Suntress. Today, a conversation with writer Denny O'Neil. Given his association with DC's Batman since 1969, it's easy to forget the many facets of O'Neil's career before ever writing a Batman story. From his early Marvel days to his inspired work at Charlton Comics, O'Neil was a fresh voice at the transition period of the late 1960s. We talk a lot about Denny's early years and highlight some of his distinguished runs beyond Batman and Green Lantern. We also find out what new projects Denny has coming up.
I wanted to start with your early days at Marvel. Is it fair to say that you were the second guy after Roy Thomas in terms of being the first group of people to write books beyond Stan Lee?
I don't know if Steve Skates immediately preceded me or immediately followed me. I don't think Steve at that point in any case did substantial writing. So, yeah, I guess that would be fair to say.
And you worked on Doctor Strange?
Well, originally it was, I think my first job was Patsy and Hetty Girls on the Go-Go. And I did some Millie the modeling with Millie. Doc Strange was the first, quote, serious character I worked on.
Okay. And actually, before Marvel, you had done a lot of work at Charlton, is that right?
No, that was after Marvel.
It was after Marvel, okay.
Yeah, Marvel was my first comic book job.
You were working at both Marvel and Charlton then at the same time?
Yeah.
And is that where the great name Sergius O'Shaughnessy came from?
Well, yeah, that was a character in a novel by Norman Mailer, a writer I very much admired at the time, and he's Mailer's character. I borrowed the name, and I no longer remember why.
Do you remember which book that was from? Was that
The Deer Park was his third novel.
I just love it because, and I know that a lot of you guys, because it was freelance work and because publishers were kind of cruel back then and weren't happy when their guys were working for more than one publisher, they had kind of unassuming names like Adam Austin, I know that was Gene Colan, and a couple other guys, and I just thought it was pretty distinct that you chose something like Sergius O'Shaughnessy.
Yeah, I didn't think I was doing anything that strange. I think that we had seen the theater version, the play adaptation of the novel, just about the time that I decided I needed a pseudonym, and then my friend John Carter and I absolutely idolized Norman Mailer when we were in college.
Before getting into comic book writing, you worked at newspapers, am I correct?
Yeah.
What kind of beats were you on as a newspaper reporter?
First was the police and hospital beat. Then I became the district news editor and general feature writer, general reporter.
You grew up in St. Louis. Was the newspaper work in St. Louis? I know.
No, it was a little town about 110 miles up the Mississippi from St. Louis called Cape Girardeau.
I'm from Illinois, so that's I'm aware of the town.
Yeah, it's right on the Illinois border.
Was there a lot of crime and was it an interesting beat in terms of?
I enjoyed the work. No, there was no substantial crime. I think the biggest thing that happened while I was working there was one of the local jewelry stores got robbed. It was a town of, 18,000 people, something like that, in the area. I was back there about 6 years ago, and it's about tripled in size. I barely recognized it. But it was just a small-town journalism job. I answered an ad in the editor and publisher, and drove up one afternoon and interviewed, and was hired.
How long did you work in newspapers?
At that job, about 6 months. I mean, I'd done journalism in the Navy.
Okay.
Which was, I guess, one of the reasons I got hired to do journalism in Cape Girardeau. But that job lasted just about 6 months.
And was it Roy Thomas that convinced you to take the Marvel writing test?
Yeah, while I was working on the paper, I was commuting back and forth to St. Louis a lot, where I had a girlfriend and family and such. And I didn't know anyone in Cape Girardeau, so I spent a lot of time hanging out at the drugstore. And between bus stations and the drugstore, I realized I was seeing comic books, and then I realized I hadn't seen them for a long time. So I picked up a couple of them, and I responded to it. I had loved comics as a kid, but when I was 9 or 10, they just left my life, partially because I got involved in other things. There was high school, there were girls, that kind of thing, and partially because I now know that comics went into a fairly severe eclipse. They were not there to be bought anymore. Mm-hmm. The little stores that had carried them when I was a kid had either gone out of business or had found something more profitable to do with the space that comic books had occupied. And then there was the whole seduction of the innocent Kefauver committee here, yes. Fuss about how corrupting comic books were. They were mm-hmm. responsible for virtually every evil that anybody under 21 was perpetrating at the time. So all of that was conspiring to just make me totally forget that comic books existed. I went to college. I was an English major with a minor in writing. I went in the Navy. The last 6 or 8 months of my Navy stay, I got passed the right kind of test and was given a job writing press releases and editing a shipboard newspaper. Then I came out with no idea what I was going to do, but pretty certain I was not going to write fiction. I thought when I left college, well, I've probably written my last short story. I really didn't understand from a university education in the 50s, exactly what writing was about. I just knew that whatever they were doing, I either couldn't do or had no interest in doing. So I was kind of floundering. I did substitute teaching for a semester or two in St. Louis, and drove a truck for my father one afternoon a week. lived very cheaply. White Castle hamburgers were only about $0.10 at the time. And then decided that I wanted to get back into writing somehow and get back into journalism. So I answered that ad. Then I did some writing about the resurgence of comic books. I did some, a little rudimentary investigating.
Okay.
And found out, comic books were in the middle of a resurgence, fueled by a whole lot of things, among which the rise of the camp sensibility. And also, popular art was becoming recognized then.
Was this during Lichtenstein's period as well as?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So I wrote a couple of features for the children's page about the return of comic books. And it so happened that Roy Thomas's parents subscribed to the paper. They lived in a neighboring town. Jackson, Missouri. So Roy got in touch with me, and one Sunday afternoon, driving back to Cape Girardeau from St. Louis, I stopped in and interviewed Roy, and I was completely captivated. My girlfriend, later my wife, who was with me, I think was bored. But, Roy was the editor of Alter Ego, and he knew about fandom, and he was taking comic books seriously, and I was just knocked out by the whole thing. So I wrote and Roy had just accepted an offer to quit his teaching job and move to New York and work as Mart Weisinger's assistant. Mm-hmm. So I did this story about Roy. You've read this story a million times. Local boy makes good. Local boy does something unusual. And stayed in touch with Roy. He went to New York. I stayed back there. And about a month after Roy moved to New York, he sent me the Marvel Writers Test. It seemed that he had stopped working with Mart Weisinger, had been hired by Stan Lee. Stan was looking for another assistant, so they sent me 4 pages of Jack Kirby art without copy.
Okay.
And asked me to add copy. Well, I don't think it was anything I was taking seriously, but sure, why not? This is only going to take about 20 minutes, and it's something to do. And it's kind of fun. And then a week after that, after I'd sent the stuff back to Roy, he called with a job offer. Well, you're like 24 years old, 25 years old, in rural Missouri, and somebody calls and offers you a job working in a comic book company in New York City. How on earth are you not going to?
Sure.
That?
Absolutely. So you were indoctrinated in comic book writing in the Marvel style, then?
Yeah.
Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I am grateful that for the first almost year, I guess, of my comic book writing venture, my job was to imitate Stan Lee, and I was successful to the degree that I managed to do that. Everybody needs to imitate somebody when they're starting out. I think that was a perfectly reasonable thing for Stan to ask, because Marvel Comics was Stan Lee.
Yes.
His style and his approach were in the process of creating and revivifying the art, the modern version of the old art form. And while trying to adhere to Stan's style, I, occasionally had little notions of my own. Maybe there would be a different way to do it, or maybe I could be more economical, so whatever. So when I went to work for Dick Giordano at Charlton, I kind of had some stuff I wanted to try, and that was a place to do it. While continuing to freelance for Stan, I went freelance after, I don't know, I seemed to only last in respectable jobs about 6 months, so I did it. Then I did some journalism. I wrote a book on presidential elections, just, general New York freelance writing, but comics were always a big part of it.
Was that about the 68 presidential election specifically, or?
It was about all presidential elections. It was a coffee table book that was, I think, intended to be distributed as Christmas gifts by corporations who would buy it in, big wholesale quantities.
I see. So then going to Charlton, was Stan and was Marvel aware of your work at Charlton, or was that all
I don't know.
Down low?
I was afraid of two things, that Stan might be offended by my working for Charlton, and also maybe that the, quotes, respectable journalism I was doing might be harmed. So that's where the presumed need for a pseudonym came from. I now think probably wouldn't have made any difference to anybody.
You did some really cool stuff at both companies, but Charlton especially, where it seems, as you say, maybe it was a looser organization and writers and artists had more freedom to really do what they wanted at Charlton.
You had A remarkable amount of freedom. I have never figured out Dick Giordano's editing method. It's magic. I mean, I don't remember him either at Charlton or later at DC giving me any direct instructions, but he managed to pull good work out of everybody who worked for him. I think it was his personality that did it. You wanted to do your best for him. And at Charlton, we were working for $4 a page. I
Sure.
think he was offering us next to nothing. And we still, probably worked as well for him as for the higher-paying editors.
And I remember Wanderer and Children of Doom, particularly, two of your projects. And I know Children of Doom was with Pat Boyette. Was it with Jim Aparo that you did?
No, that was Boyette, yeah.
Did Wanderer also? Was it?
Wanderer was Jim Aparo.
Okay.
Who hit with the art the exact tone of the script, and at the time I was too new and too dumb to realize how remarkable that was. I mean, it was a series that was basically tongue-in-cheek, and Jim's art was realistic, but it was kind of had a strong cartoon element within the realism, which was just exactly right for that character in that series. I thought, well, yeah, this is what comic book artists do. They look at the script and they realize it in the best way possible, but actually it's pretty rare that happens. And Jim was my first experience with a man that I thought was the consummate comic book professional.
You guys had wonderful stories at DC for years. Moving on to DC, I have to ask about, obviously, a lot of the changes that you seem to make hitting the ground running. What prompted the move to DC in the first place, I should ask?
Well, one day I went in to see Dick Giordano, and he said, how would you like to do exactly what you're doing now, but at 3 times the money? Okay. And it turns out he had just been hired by DC and had decided to bring some of his Charlton freelancers with him. Now, at the time I thought, well, they have seen the splendid work we're doing, and of course that's why DC Comics is anxious to employ us. I now know that DC Comics had just fired or had denied work to a lot of their long-standing freelancers because of a disagreement about the freelancers wanting, I think it was health insurance. They weren't making any extravagant demands. They weren't threatening. They were kind of asking, could you help us out? Well, the response was to cut them loose, and Steve Skates and I were, kind of warm bodies who knew how to type, knew something about writing comic book scripts. And I think that was the reason we were hired. I doubt that anybody there on the management side was really familiar with the work we had done.
So it was really just lucky in terms of the energy that you guys happened to bring.
Yeah, we were young and maybe slightly better educated than a lot of the old-timers, though that's not universally true. There was a guy named Schwartz, not Julius, but who wrote Superman, who had an advanced degree, and there was another guy who had a law degree. But we had liberal arts educations. We were young. We were probably a little bit more energetic. We were willing to work cheap. Had I known at the time that I was, in effect, a scab, it would have presented me with a terrible dilemma, because, I had mouths to feed. By that time, I was married with a kid, and I kind of needed the work, and yet the idea of profiting from the misfortune of, good, decent, honorable men would have been, I don't know which way I would have jumped. Thank God I didn't have to make the decision. Just about 10 years ago, Paul Levitz told me the whole story, and I was in the process of writing an essay about Superman for the character's 50th anniversary. I guess it was more than 10 years now. And I said to Paul, you know, you realize I'm approaching this, I'm going to put this in print, and it doesn't make the company look very good. And he said, well, it shows how far we've come. Now that kind of thing could not possibly happen, would not happen.
Well, I know that when you see things like the new Batman movie, it sounds like all the creators that, you know, had a hand in what ended up on the screen seem to be getting, you know, some sort of compensation. And
well, we didn't get credit,
okay,
but we did get money.
Okay. Well, money's nice.
Money was nice, especially if you're like 90% retired like I am. That was a very pleasant surprise when I opened that envelope containing that check.
That's cool. Let's go back to that time. Now, this was, you know, around 1968, 1969 when Julius Schwartz took over the editing on Batman. I'm curious because a lot of these guys are old guard guys. You were working with the Mort Weisingers and the Julius Schwartzes who had, you know, run the company for a couple decades and were of a different generation. And it sounds like, given your stories and the interviews that I've read with you, that you were a product of your time and you know, came with a lot of, you know, fresh ideas. How receptive were they to it? Were they looking for any type of change, specifically with somebody like Batman, given that this was right after the Adam West series? Or, you know, did they kind of balk at some of your ideas?
Well, I was lucky in that the first editors I worked with were Dick Giordano and Julie Schwartz. I might not have had an easy time with some of the other guys, the old guard, but Julie was in many ways a marvelous man. He was open to ideas. He had his way of doing things that he'd been doing for, I don't know, however long it had been at that point, maybe like 20 years, but was willing to listen and to try and to experiment. A very rare quality. I mean, Julie and I think, first approached each other very cautiously because at that time he was, you know, a guy who wore a white shirt and tie to work every day and kept extremely regular hours. And I was a hippie. I was, you know, long hair and living in the East Village. And you know, I perceived Julie as an authority figure, and I knew from my Christian brother and Jesuit education and my time in the Navy that authority figures and I did not get along. So I think we kind of circled each other initially. But he decided to take a chance on me, and he gave me a Green Lantern story to write. And 3/4 of the way through, I thought of something I hadn't included in the plot. Just threw it in, which I now know should have been a colossal no-no. I mean, you don't spring surprises on the editor. But he liked my little addition, and I think we got along very well after that. Also, I understand that he was used to working all day with a writer to come up with a plot. And I think that first session with him was an hour and a half, and then none of them thereafter took that long. So there came a time when we really got to trust each other. I knew that if I had nothing, if my cupboard was absolutely bare, I could go in. Julie would give me enough to get me started. He knew that I would deliver on time and it would be publishable. And, you know, I despite my long hair and weird clothing, comported myself professionally.
Was the one incident the famous conversation between Green Lantern and the black gentleman who...
No, it was way before that.
Okay.
It was just a regular Green Lantern story, and it was a time travel story, and I had Green Lantern back in prehistory, way vast prehistory, capture a wandering planetoid and put it into orbit around the Earth, and it was our moon. That's really cool. Lousy science, but I guess Julie thought it was an amusing conceit or something.
That's cool. And it must have appealed to the science fiction side of him, because he certainly...
Yeah, he loved SF, as I'm sure you know.
Sure.
That was his background. so that was that, and as I said, thereafter it was a generally very smooth, pleasant collaboration. But Green Lantern, Green Arrow didn't come for a while after.
Was it your idea to put Green Arrow into Green Lantern, or was that Julie's?
I think so. As I've often had reason to remember, we weren't taking notes back then, and we didn't think this stuff was going to last. I mean, it was the conventional wisdom was that the comic book audience changes completely every 3 years. So my memory of it, I'm certain how the series came about, and it was that the book was floundering in terms of sales, and as later happened with Batman, Julie said, well, do you have any ideas? Well, I had done some stuff with social relevance for Charlton, a couple of stories. Mm-hmm. And while working for Julie on the Justice League, I'd done a story with an environmental theme. And as a private citizen and father, I was still involved in the peace movement, very peripherally. So I decided this was a chance to combine comic book writing with social activism of a sort. It wasn't the sort of activism that proposed solutions, because I didn't have solutions and don't have solutions for those problems. But I thought it was probably a good idea to make people aware of them, to present them to kids who might grow up thinking about them, and therefore might have a better shot at coming up with answers than someone who became aware of these things as an adult for the first time. So I think that once that decision was made, we needed a spokesman for the kind of politics that's kind of far left of center. Mm-hmm. To change Green Lantern himself into that spokesman would have been to really, I think, violate the character. And, Green Arrow is one of those guys who'd been around since the early 40s, and he was available. He had never had his own book. He was always a supporting player. Mm-hmm. He was, for all practical purposes, a blank slate. We could do with him what we wanted.
You guys hit a lot of, beyond race. You had the Indian rights issue in Green Lantern and Green Arrow. Of course, the famous Speedy story where we find out that he's addicted to heroin. The suits were cool with all this, or were you getting calls like, wait a minute, we can't put this in a kid's book? Things like that?
I don't think the guys in the big offices knew about it until the stuff started getting attention from the press. And by that time, the attention was all favorable. The first piece of journalism I can remember, I think, was in the Village Voice, and it didn't mention Julie or Neil Adams or myself.
Okay.
Other people were I don't know if they were taking credit for it, but in any case, it was pretty much the three of us. And I don't know that very many other people knew about it until, suddenly we were getting noticed, and the notice was all favorable. Then it became a kind of bandwagon.
But unfortunately, it wasn't enough to save the book.
No, and I will never know exactly what happened.
Is it possible that there was a lag time between
there
sales?
Always was.
Yeah.
We heard sales, and that may very well have been the reason, but back in those days, I don't know that even Julie ever saw real sales reports.
Okay.
I don't know that he did, but I know later when I went to work as an editor, I did really see sales reports, and I think Dick has also mentioned that he never saw the material. So, we don't really know why it bit the dust. It's okay with me that it did, because we had really dealt with everything that concerned us. And had we gone further, it would have become Cause of the Month comics.
I got you.
The last 3 stories were, I was the first character-driven stuff I had ever written. I wasn't thinking of it in those terms, but the last 3 stories, which appeared as 8-page backups in the Flash, were not about a social problem. Was all about Oliver Queen's problems. We'd have probably gone more in that direction. I mean, we'd done environment twice, we'd done drugs twice, we had done everything that the 3 of us were concerned about as citizens and fathers.
I know that you came back to Green Lantern later on with Mike Grell.
Yeah. And
I also know that Mike, later took the Green Arrow character and had that great run in the 80s as well. Have you followed, where Green Arrow specifically has gone from the blank slate that you took and even to where it is now?
I am kind of distantly aware.
Okay. I hear that a lot from other writers, and I can appreciate that. But for yourself, after you've, been on a character for a while, is it difficult to, look at what other people are doing with it?
Yeah, I wish I was detached enough and zen enough to say, no, it isn't, but yeah.
Okay.
After I was doing Daredevil for 6 months following Frank Miller's run on it, Frank and I had a conversation. I thought I was pretty much doing Frank's character, and he said I was getting it was so much not his character that he couldn't read it anymore. Well, I completely understand that. And one of my former colleagues sent me an email this morning that they brought Jason Todd back. He was pretty angry about it, and I'm thinking, well, okay. Jason Todd was the Robin that we killed, and yes. I promised that as long as I was editor, he would not come back to life. They may have a very good reason to do it. I think it would be probably painful for me to read that story.
Now, and really, as, a great Batman writer yourself, to then edit the character for so many years, that must have been hard. I mean, and I think you succeeded because you had great writers writing the character well after your run, and very interesting turns, guys that are still connected to the character like Greg Rucka today, who I think, really built on the foundation that you created.
Yeah, well, the greatest secret an editor can have, the greatest trick in the editor's bag is hire good people. It's like directors say about casting a movie. If you get the right people, that's 90% of the job. So I made some mistakes. I did some bad casting from time to time. But basically, I looked for people who were, in terms of the writers, primarily writers, and secondarily writers who had a strong interest and aptitude for comics. But the desire to tell stories generally had to come first, not the desire to be a comic book writer and get into the conventions free and get interviewed even. Greg was a great example of that. I had read his first novel, and I was knocked out by it, and kept looking for this writer every time I went into a bookstore, and then one day he walked into my office. Likewise with assistants. I always looked for people who obviously had a strong interest or even love for comics, but had other things going for them. And I thought would approach it as adults and professionals.
You used the Hollywood analogy, and obviously the trend now is to bring writers not only from novels but from Hollywood.
That's what I'm told, yeah. The best way to break into comics is to have TV or movie credits.
And you brought in a couple Hollywood. You brought in Sam Hamm, didn't you, back in the 80s?
Yeah. I met Sam through the first Tim Burton Batman movie. We went out to dinner with our wives in Oakland, and Sam, I later discovered, was a longtime comic fan, and even acquainted with the comic book community in and around the Bay Area. So I offered him a chance to do an arc for us, and he took it, and I think everybody concerned did a fine job.
I enjoyed that run. I remember reading. I want to say, was it a one shot or it was a full series, wasn't it? A full arc.
It was 3 issues, I think.
Okay. And did Max Collins write for you as well?
Yeah.
And of course, Max certainly has a long comic book history.
Yeah, I had been a fan of his Miss Tree series.
You bet.
So, and even after he stopped doing the regular book, we did a couple of graphic novels, those kind of projects together. He is a consummate pro and very prolific.
And I loved his Dick Tracy, and I loved his Batman as well.
Oh, yeah, his Dick Tracy, I thought he really brought that character back to life.
No, I agree. I want to get back to your writing and back to the 70s, and it hit this short series hit me at the right time. I loved your Shadow run with Mike Kaluta and Frank Robbins. I thought you guys really did a great job, and I guess I was young enough. It's so interesting because I'm sure you can appreciate, Denny, there are certain characters and groups of characters like, say, the X-Men, where fans, I think, get very proprietary and really, hang on to them and are very skeptical of new writers coming on their favorite characters. And I'm wondering if back in the 70s, did you have that same kind of backlash from longtime Shadow fans?
No, I later got some of that when I did a couple of Doc Savage miniseries.
Mm-hmm.
The Shadow was generally well liked. Sales again were apparently bad, but I think we stayed pretty faithful to the source material, and I did some homework going into that. I read some of Walter Gibson's Shadow stuff,
mm-hmm.
and I listened to some of the early radio shows, and I had listened to the radio show every week when I was a kid.
Mm-hmm.
Was not as well acquainted with the Shadow's other incarnations. For comic book purposes, the pulp version was much better than the radio version. Invisibility is not a great gimmick for a visual medium, so any number of people have made it work.
Sure.
But the guy in the slouch hat and the black cloak with the big nose and the big red ring on his finger, that was real visual stuff. It was a very easy fit. I later saw some of the earlier comic versions of the Shadow. I thought, yeah, back in the 40s they were doing a terrific job with the visual aspects of the character.
I also enjoyed in the 80s when you guys got back together for Marvel and did the 1941 graphic novel.
Yeah, that was fun.
And also, it was neat seeing you with Frank Robbins, who I've later appreciated going back and seeing a lot of his newspaper strip stuff like Johnny Hazard and even his stuff with Roy Thomas, too, on The Invaders. And that was a really neat artist.
Yeah, very much in the Milton Caniff school.
Yes.
And, again, a consummate pro who paid a lot of attention to storytelling and had no temperament that I could detect. I mean, we all have egos, but the real pros managed to put them aside. And that was Frank. Yeah, I really enjoyed working with him.
Well, it was your Shadow that really made me, seek out the radio shows and the Walter Gibson paperbacks with the Steranko covers as they were coming out in the 70s. I also liked your Doc Savage, by the way, and I know that did kind of rankle a few Doc Savage fans. It was you and the Cuberts, Adam and Andy, at one of their first big assignments as pros.
Well, I thought the character needed updating somehow. I can do a long dissertation on why comic book characters, continuing characters, serialized characters, have to evolve. I don't think I'd thought it out back then, but some instinct I had said this has to be brought up to date. Now, the Shadow had been a little healthier than Doc Savage. Doc Savage was enormously popular in the 30s, and then really kind of dropped off the radar.
Mm-hmm.
There was one movie that I think didn't know if it wanted to be camp or straight.
The Ron Eli movie, sure.
Ron Eli, yeah. I barely remember it. I saw it once. So what we tried to do was to, take the basic idea that Doc Savage, genetically gifted, highly developed man, and with exactly the right five guys as his partners. It's a good paradigm for a series. It's not too far off what they do with CSI now.
Mm-hmm. I also liked the middle chapter where you look at Doc's son, who unfortunately didn't get the genetic benefits of his father, but tried to be, follow his dad's footsteps, and the futility you saw in this thin, kind of reedy, self-conscious guy trying to figure out his place in the world when he, knew he wasn't the man that his father was.
A rough draft for Azrael.
That's interesting. Okay. I also, in that same period as Doc Savage, and I appreciate that we're bouncing around, I have to mention the question. It seemed the three main characters, Izzy, Myra, and Vic, were all, in the redemption mode and trying to change the type of people that they were from, what they were before.
Yeah, of all the things I've worked on, that is my favorite. I had more freedom than I had ever had in doing with the character what I wanted. If I had been writing serious fiction at that time, novels, I would have probably been writing about the same stuff.
It surprises me that DC hasn't collected this that series, because it really does. If you look at what's coming out today, and honestly, writers like Rucka and Brian Bendis and Brian Azarello, I think that your question run specifically should be right up there as a great example that happened 20 years earlier.
Well, Greg said that he had read it in college. It was one of the things that got him interested in the medium. Well, there was a collection of the first 5 issues put together years and years ago with an introduction by Sam Hamm, who later became very close friends with Dennis Collins. And it was never published. They said because the initial orders did not justify publishing it. I don't know. Imagine me giving a big shrug here.
Okay.
Because I know that when I've gone to Spanish-speaking countries, there have been question collections. And, it's been, 10 or 15 years, and I still, at conventions and such, get asked about that run a lot. I just finished writing a novel based on the first, 8 or so comic book stories.
When will that be coming out?
I don't know. I have the copy editor caught something that made me feel like an idiot. I had Vic Sage acting on information that he couldn't possibly have. So I've got to look at that today or tomorrow, and I'm estimating it needs about an hour's worth of work. The book is done, the cover is done. It'll be out, judging by the deadline I've been working under, probably in 6 months or so.
That's terrific. I hope that makes DC come out with more trades of yours and Dennis's run. And also, I'm hoping that the questions part in the current story, 52, will create that kind of interest in your run in the question.
Well, we can keep our fingers crossed.
Absolutely. I did want to, as we bounce back and forth, I wanted to get back to the early 70s and your take on Superman. It was only a year, am I right?
Yeah.
11 issues, 12 issues?
Something like that.
Yeah. And, I remember, the classic Neil Adams cover of the kryptonite shackles being broken by him expanding his chest, and the symbolism that it involved. I mean, you got rid of kryptonite, but you also got rid of half of Superman's powers.
Yep.
And also, you got rid of the Daily Planet and put him at WGBS.
That was Julie's.
Oh, okay.
Contribution. Yeah, my first wife pointed out that had I done that 20 years later, we'd have gotten rich. But at the time, it was, it was just an assignment like any other.
It created a lot of waves in the press. I remember seeing at a barbershop the Gentleman's Quarterly where they focused on how Clark Kent kind of ditched the blue suit and all of a sudden had a new wardrobe in that.
I love that credit because I'm a guy who lives his life in blue jeans and T-shirts, and I wrote for Gentleman's Quarterly.
With that, what you did with Wonder Woman, and also the question, the I Ching character that you brought into the DC universe, and this sensei that kind of led these people. This was obviously an area that you were studying yourself, and wanted to bring it
in. That was the beginning of a lifelong interest in Asian philosophy and Asian religions and so on. I kind of regret the I Ching thing because it can be looked at as disrespecting, one of the great classics of Chinese literature. I kind of wish I'd given him a different name.
Mm-hmm. With the question series, you always have your recommended reading in the letters column. Mm-hmm. Again, that was just kind of an interesting path that you took, especially for the question. And it fit the character perfectly as well. It was, him asking his own place in the universe and the way he would handle each problem that was presented to him.
Yeah, the recommended reading didn't always have anything to do with the story. Sometimes it was just stuff that I found interesting. I think I, recommended a cookbook one month because, somebody'd given it to me for Christmas, and it was a good cookbook.
Well, let's get back to Superman and the depowering of Superman. I guess it was felt that it had gotten to a point where him pushing planets around was just a little too fantastic, and there was really nothing that could stop the guy.
Well, that was kind of my take on it. If I was going to take this job that Julie offered, I have trouble with godlike characters. And at that point in his evolution, Superman could have, put any of the Olympians, starting with Zeus, in his pocket. I mean, he was really a godlike character. So just simple practical writer considerations. How do you put God in a conflict situation? Yeah, you can do it once or twice, but how do you do it every month? And still remain consistent and credible within the, character as you presented him. It just made good dramatic sense for me to take him down a few notches. It was more of that than anything else that prompted those changes.
I really enjoyed the story that you told and thought the sand creature, the alien that took his powers and slowly became a mirror image of him, I thought that was a really neat story. And also even that low point where he was losing his powers and really had to face the group of criminals in an alley and just really had to resort to just brawling with them and was able to take them down. I thought that was a really neat moment at an interesting time when the books were still being written for, primarily a 12-year-old audience.
Yeah, but they were written for the 12-year-old in us. I mean, did Mark Twain write Huckleberry Finn for some unknown child out there, or did he write it for the 12-year-old Sam Clemens?
No, I got you. How about Richard Dragon? Another interesting character that, is it right, you co-wrote the character's start in a novel first?
Yeah, I haven't seen my co-author for maybe 20 years, and I wonder about him from time to time. Jim Barry, who was a science writer who was just beginning to get interested in writing fiction at that point. And Jim played guitar at my first wedding. He was in the peace movement. We were both writers, both commercial writers, as opposed to people who wrote essays for magazines, little alternate magazines. Mm-hmm. So I don't know which one of us suggested trying to do what we hoped would become a series. But we did a proposal the way you sold those novels in those days. An outline and 3 chapters, 30 pages, something like that. And we got the assignment for a pathetically small amount. And we did it. It was a weird collaboration because Jim was a guy who got up at 5 every morning and was hard at work by 6. I was a guy who started work often at 11 p.m. and worked, until I had run out of steam. So I could call Jim at the end of my workday and compare notes with him and decide what we were going to do next. And then Jim, it was like passing the torch.
Sure.
And for the last week, we were flat up against the deadline, so we went up to a farmhouse that Jim owned in upstate New York. And it was dueling typewriters sitting across from each other. Every once in a while breaking to run the stuff to a typist who was about to have a baby and was willing to type for us until that event happened. And we scrambled and we got the thing done.
After the book, how did it become the comic book series?
Well, way back, I had seen the first of the Hong Kong movies to get any kind of wide release over here, Five Fingers of Death. By that time, I was interested in martial arts. Then the Bruce Lee phenomenon happened. So and especially Billy Jack.
Sure.
So I went to the powers that be at DC and suggested we do a martial arts themed comic book. It seemed like great, natural fit, visual, lots of excuses for action. And I was told, I will never forget this from a besuited executive, I don't like the numbers. I don't know what numbers he was talking about. Anyway, I said, okay, we're not going to do that. Murphy Anderson would have, talked to me about wanting to draw a Billy Jack, which was a Warner Brothers movie. I now know it was owned by Tom Laughlin, who, might not have gone for the deal. Anyway, a couple of years later, I was approached and asked if I would do a martial arts book. I think the craze had peaked by then, but, I had this character, was obviously going no place as a series character for novels, so we just did the simple logical thing. It was not a hard kind of adapting to do. What really came out of it that was useful in the long term was the character Lady Shiva was created for that series. I have gotten a lot of mileage out of her since.
It's a great character. And I liked Richard as well. I like both of them coming into the question. And especially just Richard's initial introduction, looking like hell, seemingly stuck in a wheelchair, and, really kind of, presented an interesting question of, wow, what happened to him in those ensuing 10 years from the original series to the question?
Yeah, in the novel I just finished, he is identified only as Richard, and we don't get into his background.
Okay.
It was interesting to write Shiva because I realized she's a trickster character. You can never predict what she's going to do because she doesn't know. So much earlier with The Shadow, I wrote the story so as to not ever get a glimpse into her head. She is a force of nature. You can never predict what she's going to do. You just know that she will do it very thoroughly, whatever it is. Likewise with The Shadow, I realized I've got a guy who blows people away with 45s. Boy, does that ever rub the liberal in me wrong. So I decided to treat him as somebody who's not exactly the guy who is always right. He does not make mistakes, and in order to sustain that, you couldn't really give him any soap opera kind of problems, and it was probably better not to see inside his head. Now I know that from much later studying a little bit about mythology, that those are trickster characters, and they're in almost every culture.
We haven't really talked about Batman, and I obviously want to talk about him. He encompassed so much of your comic book career. First of all, do you still have Batman stories that you would like to tell?
Well, he's in the Question novel, and I enjoyed revisiting him. There's nothing that is burning in me. I mean, I probably wrote over 200 Batman stories, and I had a hand in writing thousands. So no, I mean, if somebody from DC called this afternoon and asked, would I like to do a Batman project, I'd undoubtedly say, yeah, sure. But if I never do another one, my life won't be impoverished.
Well, and you added so much to the mythos, and you brought him from the camp of the 60s to, the modern take that we still see today. It seems to have, a lot of people have kind of leaned on the Frank Miller interpretation as well, and it seems maybe they're reining him back to the balance that you had, that had the darkness, but also there was still the human element of Batman in you.
Well, there's no right way to do that character because he's a classic. I mean, he's been around for 66 years, almost 67. There's a horrible, frightening little factoid. Batman and I have virtually the same birthday. We both made our debut in May of 1939. Wow. So I always know exactly how old Batman is. But, I mean, there's been 5 or 6 versions, and I'm not prepared to say that any of them were wrong. Frank's was extremely dark. The Batman of the 50s was extremely light. But like Mel Gibson's and Laurence Olivier's and who else?
Other Hamlets?
Richard Burton's Hamlet were all Hamlet and all very different characters. That's the way Batman is. That's the way Superman is. That's one of the reasons they're still around. They have evolved to stay contemporary, to reflect the times. Characters that don't do that, like Doc Savage or the Shadow, generally survive only as memories or as artifacts.
How well do you think Hollywood has done in adapting your specific stories? Not only the movie, Batman Begins, but also I'm curious about their take on Ra's al Ghul in the animated series. I really thought the animated series kind of, as much as I enjoyed Batman Begins and it was a different story, I appreciated the adaptation that they did in the animated series.
Yeah, I completely agree. I thought the animated series, well, a few years ago I would have said the best transference of comic book material to another medium. They were very faithful to our conception of the character, and yet they knew enough about their own craft to make it good television. You always have to adapt. I thought Sin City was an almost perfect transference of comic book to screen.
You bet.
And I thought Batman Begins did a pretty damn good job of it. I walked into that screening with a lot of baggage.
Sure.
And left very satisfied.
Well,
I mean, by that time I had written the novel and had consulted on the video game, so I really knew the story, and I knew there was no way I was going to be objective about it. But even looking through a very clouded lens, I thought it's a good movie, and B, a good adaptation of that material to another medium.
And how much did the script change from what you had for the novelization to what you finally saw on screen?
A bit. The first third of it or so was different. I got the script, though, much later in the process than I'm used to. I mean, I did comic book adaptations of 3 or 4 of the movies and was getting the same script changes that the actors and director were getting.
Okay.
With Batman Begins, they were very late getting me the script. I had seen a preliminary version that somebody had downloaded off the net and actually got started with that. But it changed a bit. Movies always do, but much less than other movies I know about.
Okay. Are you going to be involved with the sequel or anything? Are they going to come to you, or are they on their own right now? And now that they've begun their franchise?
I know that. I've heard that Chris Nolan wanted to talk to me. Mary Fran and I did not get to go to the Hollywood premiere because of things in our lives here. And Paul Levitz told me that Christopher Nolan had hoped that I would be there so we could talk. I'm not going to be involved in writing the movie. The movie's written by now.
Right, okay.
It's always possible that I'll get picked to do something associated with it. I'm sitting here and they know my phone number. And, I am, for these days, a freelance writer. If it's a reasonable project, of course.
And how are you feeling these days, Denny? I know you had a little health issue last year. I think so.
3 years ago, I died. That's a tough act to follow. I was sitting in a restaurant and talking with an old friend and her son, and she tells me I was talking about why I don't believe in an afterlife, and then I suddenly keeled over, and she thought I was trying to be funny.
Wow.
And after about 30 seconds, she saw I was turning colors. So she made noise or did something, and it's just every breath I take is a gift, because I was lying dead on the floor of the sidewalk cafe, and the guy who owns it is also a fireman, and he knew that the town hall, this is the town of Piermont, had just purchased a defibrillator, so he ran next door, got that, came back, and used it on me. On the third try, the second try, my heart started beating, but machines are wonderful. It tells you what you should do.
Okay.
If you should, use the electricity or not. Third jolt, heart was beating more or less normally. At that point, the paramedics arrived, and the first thing I remember is lying in Nyack Hospital looking up at my wife's face, and she was asking, "Do you know what happened?" And I said, "No." I now know that there was a lot more to it than that I tried to hit the guys who were trying to save my life.
Wow.
And I used language that my mother never taught me, and I guess what that's about is, well, your body knows it's just been hit with 50,000 volts of electricity 3 times. And it sees somebody and decides, that's who did this to me. But they pulled Mary Fran out of work. She is a teacher here in town.
I see.
And by that time, it was all kind of by the numbers from there on. That is something that Western medicine is very good at. They basically needed to take some little pipes out of my arm and leg and chest and put it in my heart, and they did that very well. What is interesting about that with regard to comic books is I was in the middle of writing a sequence which would have killed Azrael. Killed him dead. That's how Mike Carlin and I had decided to end that series. While I was still in the hospital recovering from the surgery, Mike called Mary Fran and said, "Tell Denny he doesn't really have to kill Azrael." that's hitting a little too close to home.
Sure.
So, and Mike was very generous and must have moved heaven and earth, because it was 3 months before I could work, which must have put him badly behind deadline. But we got the thing done, and Azrael maybe died, maybe didn't. The door is open to bring him back should anybody ever choose to do that.
That was a long run. That was over 100 issues, wasn't it, for Azrael?
It was exactly 100 issues. Yeah, we knew the book was dying, and Mike made a decision to let it run to 100 issues, just to give me the opportunity to write 100 straight issues of something and to kind of round off the series for the people who liked it.
Much like it, I remember seeing you on the History Channel documentary talk about Jason Todd and say that there was a character that, kind of took on his own life, and people really ended up resenting Jason just for who he was. I mean, it wasn't really done with any conscious way, but that Jason kind of became a snot. Now, in the case of Azrael, he was created to be the bad guy of that Nightfall story.
Yeah, very specifically a case of a character being created to serve a specific plot purpose.
And you co-created him with Joe Quesada. He was your artist, which is...
And under the tutelage of the late, great Archie Goodwin.
Oh, he was the editor?
Yeah.
Oh, that's really cool. And Archie, what a wonderful guy. And
he was the best, one of the best people I've ever known. I really miss him.
Everyone I've spoken to says that, and I think that's a real testament to the man. So Nightfall ends, or Night's Quest ends, and Batman is Batman again, and you're left with Azrael. And it surprised you that they did want to do a series.
Yeah, I mean, he was a villain, and he was pretty much disposed of at the end of that gigantic series. But it was, again, one of those offers that would be very difficult to refuse. I mean, it was a character I created, and somebody wanted to do him as a monthly book, and I was not overburdened with writing work at the time. I don't know that, I think there were weak issues. and I don't know that we ever really got exactly the right handle on him. There were people who were fanatically devoted to the character and really mourned when the book died. So he had much more than most of the characters I worked with. The people who liked him really liked him a lot.
Okay.
But in terms of personality, he was about 180 degrees away from superhero or even hero.
Yeah, I saw a similarity in your question run, I guess.
Yeah, except that Fixate was in a way much tougher.
Yes. You mentioned you've got the question novel coming up. What else is coming up for you?
Oh, tomorrow evening I will talk with an editor from another publisher about maybe writing a comic book themed novel. Known the guy for 10 years, and we have talked about it off and on. I thought about starting it in the middle, last year, and then in very quick succession, Batman Begins, and then The Question, both of jobs I wanted to do. So I might be writing a serious novel this year.
That's great.
My son is urging me to do it. I think Mary Fran would like to see me try it. Scares me to death at age 67 for the first time I'm going to write a serious novel that's at least partially based on my life. Wow. Gee. I got into one of the great attractions of comics for me was it's disreputable. It's not supposed to be good. When I started, it was not considered an art form. I think comic book writers were considered about a half step above pornographers. And I didn't mind that. I wasn't sure I could handle what I knew of the literary world. I'm not sure what being a writer in that world consists of, and I had no confidence that I could produce quality material. I did have confidence that if they wanted it on Thursday, I could get it to them on Thursday. Without the baggage of being an author. Oh, boy, that's scary. That's the stuff you study in school. But it has changed. We are now ultra respectable. The New York Times does stories 2 or 3 times a month about comics. It's the ultimate arbiter of what has become respectable. If it's in the Times, you know it's accepted.
Absolutely. Well, and your body of work, I think, in the comic book world, I think, had a lot of good, serious writing in it, and I hope this does happen, and I hope.
I think working in a kind of disreputable medium had a very freeing effect. It just allowed me to do what seemed right and natural without worrying about what somebody was going to think about it or write about it.
Well, that's really cool. I think that's excellent. And I look forward to the question book, and I hope when the question book comes out that we can talk again, and you can tell us a little bit more about this upcoming novel project.
Oh, sure. Be happy to.
Well, I appreciate your time today.
My pleasure.
Well, it took about another 12 years before we had another conversation, and one of the reasons why was Denny, every time I would think about having an interview with him, I was hearing about that he was in poor health. He had heart troubles all of his life. He was a recovering alcoholic. In 2018, prior to our first conversation in that year, he had a very bad car accident that laid him up and had him, living with assisted living. Denny was a health nut. He would run. He talked about that in our first conversation of 2018 in the previous episode. And so, it was tough. He was able to bounce back and, lived another 2 years managed to go to some conventions in the meantime and stuff. And I'm really glad and met more fans and sold more books. And I'm glad about all of that. But yeah, his son, Larry O'Neill, was like, hey, you did a great conversation with my father. I don't know if you'd be interested in talking to him again. And I'm like, are you kidding? I've been waiting for that opportunity. That was before that first conversation that you heard in the previous podcast. So again, I really let Denny kind of tell his story that he wanted to tell. And also I know it was to promote his autobiography. So this conversation that you're about to hear was really more about Batman. And I'm like, is it okay? Could we do one? And he was a sweetheart about it. He was like, of course. So this is from August of 2018. It was after that Terrificon show where the Robin panel that we did, which was a lot of fun. But here in his own words, Denny O'Neill about his career to wrap things up on this episode of Word Balloon. If you're ready, we'll dive in.
Splash.
Welcome back, Denny O'Neil, to Word Balloon. As I was just telling you off the air, it's a pleasure to have you back, and I appreciate your clarity of memory and your stories. How are things going in terms of, last time we spoke, you had released your semi-autobiography, half fiction, half true tales, and how's the response been?
That book is the best-kept secret since the invasion of Normandy.
Oh, man. I'm assuming you're going to have the autobiography with you for Terrificon for people to buy and sign, I hope.
I guess I am. They only gave me 10 comps, and I pretty much gave all those away, so I bought 15 more copies. I do have some copies.
Great.
I don't know what to do about that book. I don't know even what I think about it. If you want to save yourself 5 years' worth of psychotherapy, write an autobiographical novel, because the feedback I have gotten, people remember things I didn't even know about because I did them in blackouts. And a lot of them are pretty bad, pretty ugly. But I had no memory of them until I get reminded, and then I realized, God, I was a prick. I could have been a monster.
Yeah, and then facing those kind of, past behavior and stuff, yeah, that's got to be humbling. Or is it because, again, these are memories that were blank, that they are kind of surprising, and I don't know, how do you process that?
You face them, and my ex-girlfriend has filled in a lot of blanks. My brother, Dave, and my brother Tom have filled in a lot of the blanks. It was worse than I thought.
Wow.
I don't quite know how I got through that without really damaging myself. But I did, and I don't know why some people are able to turn that corner and other people aren't. I didn't plan for the novel I wrote to be as much about drinking as it was, but if you're trying to write about that time in the history of comics, and you're trying to do it from one viewpoint, it's very hard. I mean, without completely making the whole thing up out of whole cloth, it's very hard to not acknowledge those things. So, 40% of the way through the book, I said, well, this is a battle that's not worth fighting. I will simply tell the story, and we'll see where it goes.
I wonder if when you were writing things like that famous Green Lantern, Green Arrow story about Speedy's addiction,
Mm-hmm.
how much of it, were you in a place that you could, write about that kind of addiction? And were you in denial of your own issues, or, where was it in the context of your drinking? Did it inform that story at all?
It probably did. There is a couple of panels very early on in the continuity in which they mention that alcoholism is another form of addiction. I was at a point where I was getting drunk 5 or 6 nights a week. I now know that I was violent and ugly a lot of that time.
Wow.
But nobody was calling me an alcoholic yet. My mother went to her grave without putting my name and the word alcohol in the same sentence.
And what years were these? What decades were these that this was happening?
This is mostly the 70s.
Wow.
I mean, the novel started out as something very different than what it ended up as. And what I wanted to do was tell the story of how comics came of age.
Yeah.
my son was twisting one arm, and I guess Mary Fran was twisting the other, and they kept saying, "You should write your story." And I objected to that, but I finally agreed if I could combine it with a fantasy and not have any of my self-imposed rules, it would be an interesting thing to try. It's writing a novel the way we were taught in college novels are written, and they're mostly not written that way. But, sit down, wait for the angel of inspiration to light on your shoulder and whisper in your ear, and then make it up as you go along. I've written about 10 novels, only 2 did I make up as I was going along. And one, if I had my way, every single copy of that book in the world would vanish, would suddenly evaporate, because I certainly don't want anybody to read it who hasn't already, and it does have my name on the cover. That was, it was a pretty easy job to do, and I did have the experience of writing a novel, writing a science fiction novel. When that was completed and published, I realized I am now a science fiction writer. I have published a book that has been marketed as science fiction, and I don't know what an atom is. So I tried to fill in that huge gap in my education. I mean, I went to St. Louis U, and if you were an English major, you didn't take any science courses. You weren't allowed to.
Okay.
But it occurred to me, and I was right, that anybody who lives in our time, in our era, should know some science, especially if you're going to presume to write about it. So there was a book called 1, 2, 3, Infinity that was a popularization of Einstein's theories. And that book was a huge help and a good start. And then now I've got probably 100 college courses on disc across the room there, and maybe 20-25% of them have to do with science and math. I still can't do math, but I find science fascinating. There's an item in the Gannett papers this morning about how our galaxy ate another galaxy.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, I find that stuff really cool.
Sure. Prior to that exploration of science, do you feel that your writing was more space opera then in terms of science fiction?
Well, no, I didn't think about it very much. One of the secrets of being a professional writer of the kind that I am is don't burden yourself with being an author, or don't carry into the job a lot of expectations. If I can get an editor and say, we need this by the 25th, it has to be 75,000 words, and that gives me some problems to solve. Okay, I know I can solve problems. I don't operate the way my son does. He is very scrupulous about getting every syllable right. I'm not. I think it's a job, and if I start thinking about, I'm competing with Alfred Bester here, I'm competing with Isaac Asimov, I'll be paralyzed. I'm not as good as those people. I never will be, or never was. So if I think about it the way I used to think about newspaper work, the press thing, he's going to press the red button at 10 o'clock, my story has to be on there, on the press.
Yep.
That I can handle. When I have a book to write, I do simple long division. I can do that much math. Beyond that, I'm lost. But if I have 100 days to do this, and it has to be 100,000 words, That's how long I've got. That's how much I have to do every day. In the first hardcover, I was in a bad car crash in the middle of writing it. This was Batman Retires, the first really major continuity we did. Nightfall, it was called. And I had to kind of alter my method for 3 weeks. I couldn't write or do any work, but we made it. Wow. Charlie Kostman and I spent the last weekend sitting in my bedroom in Brooklyn, going over the manuscript and editing it there and then. It had to be on the presses by noon Monday. This was Friday. Charlie and I spent the weekend editing that book, and we made the deadline. Charlie gets huge thanks. He was one of the best editors I've ever had. And the book, given all the handicaps that there were in getting the thing done, one of which was we knew we were going to do this novelization, and I didn't know that there was going to be any BBC adaptation, but I knew that there would be comic books and other stuff. And the deadline would be non-negotiable. So, but I said, I'm writing 2 or 3 comic books a month. I'm editing a franchise that only 24 hours in the day. I can't manage this. There just isn't enough time. And Mary Fran said, if you let somebody else do this, you'll never forgive yourself. And I said, well, when you put it like that, you're absolutely right. So every Saturday morning, Mary Fran and I would get in the car and go out to the end of Brooklyn to a shopping mall, meet Charlie Kochman. I would give him the work I had done in the past 6 days. He edited as he went along, and then, as I said, we did the final rewrites and edits really under the gun. Mary Fran bringing in cookies and coffee every 5 or 6 hours. And we got through it. I am delighted that I had that experience. And I never want to do anything like that again. I bought a computer. I bought a laptop computer. I hadn't used any computers up to that point. But driving to St. Louis, we both got sleepy. Mary Fran and I, after lunch, I had been driving, and I told her, "You've got to do this. I can't keep my eyes open." She said, "I can't either. I'll tell you what, you drive for the first hour, and then I'll take it." We hit a wall doing 70 in the middle of that hour. So we spent Christmas Day in an intensive care ward in a little mountain town in Pennsylvania.
Jesus.
And understand, I had the book about 40% done. The car, I'm told by people who saw the accident, flipped over 3 times, and the computer was loose in the back seat. So we got put into an intensive care ward, and the doctor asked what he could do for me, and I said, go out to wherever what's left of the car is and get my computer.
Wow.
The computer was fine, no glitches. I should have written Apple a thank you letter because I did that as a hardcover, and we knew it was going to be a big deal. In fact, we sort of set out to do a big deal Batman project. What I didn't know was that over across the corridor, Mike Carlin was doing something very similar with Superman. Same thing. He dies.
Yes.
Comes back.
Yeah.
So I eventually went to Paul and said, why didn't you tell me that Mike was doing this? Because we have 2 stories going at the same time. We're getting 1 year's benefit out of this. We could have gotten 2 years. And he said, no, I did that deliberately because we want to tell the fans, hey, look at these scenes. Stuff is really happening over there, all over the place.
Yeah.
I don't know if he was right or wrong, but he did have, as always with Paul, he has reasons. And they're generally good ones.
It piqued my interest. I mean, I was certainly reading both stories. And that's interesting because I thought that Nightfall almost was inspired by the Superman Doomsday and Death of Superman story. So that's interesting in that typical way that sometimes it's just in the atmosphere. And you guys independently were both thinking along the same lines. That's pretty interesting. And I don't think a lot of people knew that. Pretty amazing.
No, I'm sure that a lot of people thought as you did, but I was following in Mike's footsteps. And if you know how publishing worked, it wasn't possible for me to follow in his footsteps because we had the same lead time. We had the same deadline.
Sure. Wow. Nightfall really was, I think, a terrific story. And was it in response to the things that were happening at Image and those more extreme superheroes that, you know, those guys that left Marvel were doing on their own?
No, I knew about those guys. Image sent their whole company up to drop in on DC and make a visit. And at least I think some of my colleagues thought, well, they're, coming to make peace with us. And that they were telling us they were going into competition with us, which they did very successfully for a few years. Mm-hmm. But what happened with us is, I guess my primary concern was always storytelling, and I realized that I had the freedom to do a 2,000-word story with a character who it has been estimated would be recognized by 80% of the people on the planet. And I thought, this is a rare gift they are giving me as a storyteller. I can actually do this. I don't know if we can bring it off, but I know that nobody will stop me from trying. So we had done the Robin Dies story, and I thought that sends a message to the readers, the loyal readers, that we are not above killing Batman. So we were at a retreat very close to where I'm sitting. I didn't know about Nyack, but it's across the river from Tarrytown. And we realized if we're going to make the world think that Batman is dead, it's a pretty big step to take. I better get permission. So either one of my assistants or I called New York every 90 minutes or so and explained what we were going to do and said, it's not too late. We've plotted the next 6 months, but it's not too late to change. If there's going to be any problem with this, tell me. And I got all the go-aheads I needed, so cut to 3 months later, and we're into the story, and I'm crossing a lobby from the building, at the building where DC had its headquarters, and I run into an executive who tells me I have to bring Batman back to life. And I tried to explain, look, if nobody reads any Batman this year and they pick it up in a year, they won't know that anything has happened. We're going to put all the pieces back where you would like them to be. Didn't make any difference, so I had to compromise our story by inventing that subplot where Batman disguises himself as a British detective. As a writer, it gave me a challenge. Can I do British, a convincing British accent?
Okay.
In cold print. That compromised the story pretty badly. And my guess, based only on experience with that world, is that the people we were calling during the retreat did not bother to ask their superiors if it was okay to do this. So for the guys in the real big offices, this was a bad shock to them. Batman's dead. Batman is worth billions.
Well, yeah, this is in the midst of the movies, obviously, and I'm sure things were. I mean, sales certainly hadn't dropped as I understood it, or maybe they did. I don't know. So, what was your?
No.
Do you mind revealing what your original story plan was? Were you planning to, after killing Batman, revive him, or did you want him to stay dead and have John Paul Valley or Dick Grayson, someone else, taking over the mantle?
No, we live in the real world, and I knew I would not get away with permanently killing Batman. But I thought I could get away with having him off stage for a year.
Mm-hmm.
So that was really what we were going to do. Batman goes off. I hadn't plotted it that far. One of the basic disagreements I had with my crew was they wanted to plot every beat at the retreats, and I wanted to know what the big events for the next 6 months are, and let's give our writers some elbow room to come up with better ideas. So we were going to bring Bruce Wayne back, probably more or less as he was brought back eventually, though one of my freelance writers had some uncharitable things to say about curing somebody by laying on of the hands. It's since been done on television series. But I was going to replace Batman with Jean Paul Valley for a year, and then maybe kill off Azrael, and everything would be as it was. Almost when we were almost at the end, they asked me to do Azrael as a hero and as a monthly book. Well, again, it was, if I let somebody else do this, I'll never forgive myself. But he was conceived as a villain.
Right.
So I don't know. I have very mixed feelings about the series. I think maybe the middle run, the middle third, was pretty weak, and the rest of it was probably okay. I never read published material, and that's not an exception. They did do another Azrael series and neglected to pay me for that, and I decided not to make a fuss about that.
Wow.
But
yeah, that's
they are now obligated to pay us for ancillary use of stuff we've created, which is a huge step forward from, say, 10 years ago.
That's great to hear, and I know you mentioned that last time, like they're using Leslie Tompkins in Gotham, and I'm glad that you're being compensated for that. I just talked to Jerry Ordway, and he was telling me about how Supergirl was using Cat Grant, and that he was being compensated. So no, that's great to hear. And God, I mean, geez, man, the additions to the Batman house, if you put it in architecture terms, that you made over these decades and stuff, absolutely, man. I hope you're getting paid, and I'm glad to hear that it has gotten better. And I understand that. As you told me in our last conversation, that Howard Chaykin's lawyer has been pretty instrumental in kind of making all that stuff happen. Am I correct?
Yeah, he's a very good man, and a very nice man, and a very good lawyer. He
good.
When the need for a lawyer arose in my life, I had the indispensable Larry call around. I said, see if you can find me who the best lawyer for comic books is. And he came up with Harris Miller, who was amazingly cooperative and very generous. He could have charged me 2 or 3 times what he did. So, yeah, Harris, I've had occasion to call him once or twice since. Well, in the novel, the hero of the novel was originally Captain Power.
Yes, yes.
And I had Harris look up Captain Power, and he said, well, there are 3 Captain Powers who are actually under copyright. Probably nobody will make a fuss, but they could if they wanted to. So that's why we changed it. But Harris didn't, he just did that as a favor to me. Well,
that's
yeah,
cool.
I can find that out.
That's excellent. Yeah, man. Very cool.
The really good news happened when we went to see Batman versus Superman. And we looked at that. When I heard that they were making that, I thought, are they aware of what they've let themselves in for? These characters have never belonged in the same universe. It's an accident of publishing history that they are yoked. But it's not a good idea because one guy juggles suns and one guy can bench press probably 500 pounds and swim real fast and stuff. But they're not the same kind of character. The mythology is real different. But we saw at the beginning credits of that movie, Batman co-created by Bob Kane and Bill Finger. So when we got home, I know Bill Finger's granddaughter a little bit. I've been on panels with her, and I had her phone number. So Mary Fran called her when we got home and said, how did you... Denny never was able to put your grandfather's name on anything that had to do with Batman. Was this a one-time only thing? And Althea said, no, we actually finally won a lawsuit. And from now on, the name Bill Finger will be, anytime you see the name Batman, you'll see Bill Finger. Bob Kane's name is still on it, and he had virtually nothing to do with the character as we know it. Mm-hmm. But at least Althea, Bill died, I'm told, broke and probably drinking too much. But my one evening with him was very drunk.
Wow.
But Althea, at least his granddaughter, will live comfortably. When I went out to visit the set, one of the Time Warner executives told me that every time we do a Batman movie, I write a 7-figure check for Bob Kane.
Wow.
So, like in the mid-50s, being paid for Batman probably didn't amount to much, but those movies have made billions with a B, of course. And little surprise, little bonus, they're good movies.
Yeah, absolutely. Most of them. Certainly most of them.
The last 3, I don't count Joel Schumacher's contribution.
Understood. I think a lot of fans agree with you on that.
Well, apparently Joel agrees.
Yeah, I heard him on Fresh Air, the NPR interview show. And he talked about having to create scenes. They would bring him a toy prototype and say, we need a scene like this in Batman and Robin. And I think that kind of obviously contributed to the goofiness of the Clooney movie, certainly. The Kilmer movie also, a little, not as great as, the 2 that Tim Burton did. But I thought Val Kilmer did okay. In spite of a lot of the zaniness, and you've got Jim Carrey as the Riddler. And, man, what a waste of Tommy Lee Jones. Wouldn't it have been interesting, I'm sure you agree, to see him really get into the, 2 faces, literally, of Harvey Dent. And they
apparently he was directed to play Two-Face like the Joker.
Wow.
He played him campy.
Yeah. And they really barely got into that wonderful backstory of Harvey Dent, the district attorney that worked with Batman. And I even very quickly, there was like a moment of clarity where Tommy Lee Jones is like, "You're right, Bruce. He tries to appeal to Harvey, and for a second, Harvey's sane and talking to him, and it's like, oh, there's that relationship. But that was like 20 seconds, and like I said, a missed opportunity. So,
yeah, and then the George Clooney one, the best part of the script, which I thought was at best mediocre, but it was a subplot which explains. It gives Bruce Wayne an out. He's been blaming himself for his parents' death, and he gets a piece of information, and he's not responsible for it. He thought that he made his parents go to the theater that night, and it turns out that they delayed their theater sojourn for 24 hours, so it wasn't his fault at all. I might quarrel with that as a Batman storyteller because I always thought that the symbolic avenging of the Wayne's death was part of the essence of the character. Nonetheless, that was a very well-written subplot that answered questions, and they just cut it.
Interesting.
They left a couple of lines in that don't make any sense without a context to put them in. But that is the movie biz.
I hear you, man. I wonder, I just, and not to name drop, but for context, a couple months ago I had a dinner with Mark Miller, and we were talking about Superman. And the question of, is Superman Kal-El of Krypton, or is he Clark Kent that learns he's Kal-El of Krypton and grows up with the Earth values? And, Clark is the man, Superman is the guys. And Mark's disagreement was, no, he is, so smart being a Kryptonian that it's almost like being raised by a colony of ants in terms of the intellectual difference of a Kryptonian and an Earthman. And I wondered regarding, I'm sure you've been hit with this question before, is Batman the real man? Is Bruce Wayne a guise, or is this a traumatized Bruce Wayne that, is still, at the end of the day, a guy trying to do good, but, what is your thought on the Batman versus Bruce Wayne guys?
I think Bruce Wayne died with
his parents,
mom and dad.
Okay.
And from then on, Bruce allowed that tragedy to shape the life decisions he made. So in my mind, I never got from any writer except myself the kind of Bruce Wayne I wanted. There has been, particularly with the movies, a tendency to make Bruce Wayne, this very smart, ruthless tycoon guy. I think he should have been, I had a real-life person that owned a magazine I freelanced for.
Huh.
A guy who was really a nice man, inherited a vast fortune, and kind of blew it by never being able to get his act together. My Bruce Wayne would be driving a Ferrari, but he'd have a dent in the front fender because he backed it into he hit something the first time he took it out. And he was totally dependent on his assistants, as I occasionally was, to get things done. Love life, I didn't think there would have been any room for a relationship. So in my private version, Gotham City is full of debutantes who had one date with Bruce Wayne and said, he got a headache. He took me home at 10 o'clock. He just wasn't feeling well. I couldn't see him as a lover, and the information I just got that he's making it with Catwoman. Well, the dynamic with Ra's al Ghul was he could never get it on with Talia. So clearly they were the only two people on the planet who were ideal for each other. But she had a daddy hang-up, and he had a criminal hang-up, and she was a criminal, so he could never do that. I thought that added attention to the continuity that, helped the story along.
I understand. And what did you think when, there's a couple times when Steve Englehart created Silver St. Cloud, and we had the laughing fish story. Were you editing then, or were you also?
No, I was a freelancer.
Okay, yeah, you guys were both writers of Batman. Okay, so
and Steve convinced the powers that be that he was a hot writer. I never paid attention to things like who's hot, or there was a kind of pecking order. If you were the guy who wrote Superman, you were higher on the pecking order than if you were the guy that wrote Power Man. But those things weren't part of some people's experience. And when I finally took over editing the franchise, I simply ignored Silver St. Cloud. I thought it was a bad idea. I didn't think that Batman would fall in love with a debutante. So we didn't have to write her out. We could just ignore her. It was the same way with Batman's child in that graphic novel that Mike Barr did.
Son of the Demon.
I thought that was I thought that was a terrible idea in terms of Batman storytelling. But I didn't have to write it out. I explained to Mike, and we took a long walk around the lake in Hollywood, that I was not going to ever refer to that, and this is nothing against you, Mike. It's, in my editorial opinion, it's not a good storytelling trope. I don't think Mike has ever forgiven me for that, but they have brought those characters back, and that's now an official part of the continuity.
That's right. Yeah, Damian's part of the story now.
And you have to remember that there is no right or wrong in this.
Oh,
stuff.
Sure. Absolutely, man. Yeah.
That was my opinion of how the story and the mythos should play out. Doesn't mean I was right or wrong. It was my opinion, and it was working.
I understand. Absolutely, man. You're known for some of your guidelines, if not rules, for writing Batman. And I know one of them, and I imagine it might dovetail into what you were saying earlier about Superman. And I want to explore that for a second. But one thing I know that you said was you didn't like Batman in space, and that you would kind of, shy away from those stories and stuff as much as you could. Sometimes there was a big event, and I suppose, they expected the Batman comics to dovetail into an event. But it seemed, again, I only get my information from the fan magazines of the day, but it sounded like you weren't crazy about the idea of putting Batman in space.
I thought it was a terrible idea, in the same way it was a terrible idea for Eisner to put the Spirit in space. They're not that kind of character. The mythos, the mythic underpinnings. For Batman, it's more Dracula than Percival or any of the King Arthur's men.
Okay.
I don't think those guys were thinking about this stuff with the left side of their brains, but in a way, Batman is brilliant because we are fascinated by darkness and evil. Villains are almost always more interesting than heroes. Well, here you have that iconography of the dark, and in every culture that I know about, except Chinese, bats are symbols of evil or reincarnated souls or stuff like that. So you have that iconography, but he's on our side. He's a good guy. Mm-hmm. So you had your cake and eat it. Putting him in space makes it, what I think of as science fiction light, just not appropriate for the character as we were doing him then. It doesn't mean that somebody will come along and write a terrific Batman in space story.
Sure.
If it's happened, I haven't seen it.
Well, and how often, again, based on what you said about the Batman Superman ideas, that they were kind of conflicting, universes in the same publishing house. How often did Superman show up in your Batman stories, if ever?
Only when there was a crossover. And I never resisted participating in the crossovers because that was sitting, going in, it's not your ball and it's not your bat and your daddy doesn't own the park.
Sure.
Something that is like that, we had to participate in it. I was always able to contrive it so that Batman occupied a little distant corner of the story and could do Batman-like things and did not have to deal with ray guns and spaceships and aliens. The Batman as a storytelling tool was flexible enough that we could get away with cheating like that once in a while, as long as I didn't have to do it every month.
Understood. And again, what about the interpersonal relationship with Superman? How did you tackle it when it necessitated a conversation between Clark and Bruce?
I didn't ever write that scene. I don't remember. Well, Miller kind of answered that.
Sure.
If I'm remembering my continuity, Superman gives Batman a piece of kryptonite and says, if I ever go off the deep end, use this. I thought that was a good way to nod toward established continuity and still do it with a logical story point.
I think that was John. So, I think that was John Byrne in Man of Steel.
Was that Byrne?
Yeah, and I also wonder, as John Byrne came in, that period, because obviously you had Frank writing Batman Year One, and certainly before it, The Dark Knight Returns. That was such a great evolution of the character. And in the meantime, Byrne was doing his thing with Man of Steel, and obviously rebooting Superman and kind of changing things around, stripping away a lot of that Mort Weisinger era and even Julie Schwartz era, obviously. So how did when there was this newer Superman, did did the character change at all for you from an editorial standpoint or a writing standpoint?
Yeah, excuse me. Water.
Oh yeah, by all means, yeah, Denny. And by the way, we've already gone an hour. Am I taxing you? I don't want to.
No, you're not. I have nothing to do until tomorrow at 2. So.
Well, I'm enjoying the conversation, so please continue.
But yeah, I resisted being involved with Superman when that first arose. And my problem was basically what we do is fantasy melodrama. The essence of melodrama is conflict. You have to have a worthy opponent for your hero. To have Superman go after pickpockets would be ludicrous. Well, how do you keep contriving a problem for Superman to solve? I mean, I did the Justice League for about 1.5 years.
Absolutely.
And that's where that problem arose. When I did my 4th or 5th alien invasion, I realized my creative tank is empty as far as this character is concerned. Later writers did a much better job than I did of making it make sense and getting good stories out of it. But yeah, they to my mind, they did not belong in the same story. And if you have Superman, it depends on which era, but at his most powerful, he was God. He was juggling suns. He was able to search every room in Metropolis in a second or so. Then how do you put that character in a believable conflict? He can do anything. So why doesn't he solve whatever problem it is in the second panel? You had to contrive answers to that if you were going to be consistent with the character. Back in the 40s when they were creating this stuff, they didn't worry about that. And they shouldn't have. I mean, it was not part of the problem they had to solve. A lot of them, well, Jerry, you mentioned Jerry before, who became a pretty close friend of mine toward the end of his life.
Jerry Siegel.
Great guy. And he did occasional script changes when he was, a very young guy doing comics. But that was okay because nobody knew how to write comic books back then. And the mistake I most often ran into when I was teaching was people ask things of the artist they can't deliver. So Jerry had a natural gift as a storyteller, and he was a very good artist. And if some writer who had never written a comic book before asked for something that couldn't be accommodated in that very limited and artificial storytelling tool that was the comic book, Jerry could change it. I think that I've been rewritten a few times. I deeply, deeply resent it. It's one of the reasons I don't read published work, and I made one horrible life mistake this within the past year. I watched myself on television. I watched the public. I don't normally do that because I don't like the way I look. But I watched the public television thing,
yes,
and that was a terrible mistake on my part because it was apparently I didn't have much to do with Green Lantern and Green Arrow. Apparently the artist wanted to draw a Green Lantern, so he got Julie Schwartz to. And then Denny wrote a script.
Wow.
No, Denny wrote the script a long time before the artist was involved. Denny thought the script was going to be done by Gil Kane. But it's nothing to get lathery about, but it is annoying.
Well, let's set the record straight. Let's talk about that Green Lantern, Green Arrow run, because I was thinking about how Siegel and Schuster very early on in Superman really had Superman attacking social justice issues, and I know there was a very early issue where it cleaned out a slum and really kind of improved it. And,
went after an evil mine owner, a capitalist.
Yes, and of course, the famous radio story of him going after the Klan and things like that. So,
and also on the radio, an anti-Semitic story.
Yes, very much so. Yes. So yeah, tell me, was the first Green Lantern, Green Arrow story about where that classic scene happens, where the elderly black gentleman says, "Hey, you save the orange skins, you save the purple skins. What are you doing for the black skins here on Earth?"
No, that way Neil did not only serve the script, but I thought that's among the three best panels ever in the history of comics. And one of the things that absolutely delights me is my favorite politician, who turns out to be a huge comics fan, and the only person I know who ever read all of Philip K. Dick. He used that as a campaign thing. He rewrote the dialogue.
Wow, cool.
That guy's name is Alan Grayson. He is a Democratic congressman currently up for re-election from Florida. And I got this. Mary took a phone call, and she said there's this congressman who wants to know if he can buy a coffee or a drink or something. And I thought, well, okay, he probably wants my help because he's going to do a campaign comic book. So I arranged to meet the guy, and no, we didn't talk about politics. We talked about comic books. I gave him a 5-minute crash course in visual narrative done in static images. And then he told me, we got on Philip K. Dick, and he told me that he had read all of Philip K. Dick's exegesis. I think that's something like 5,000 pages. I don't know anybody else who even tried to do that.
Very cool. I'm looking him up. I want to make sure. I think I know Alan Grayson. I think he's made himself known at times.
Well,
yes.
He doesn't take corporate money. He's the real deal, as far as I can tell.
Yes, I'm looking.
I don't think it's possible to be a major politician and remain uncorrupted. But he's been on my radar for a few years now, and I get 2 or 3 emails from him in a week. He looks like the real deal. As I said, he grew up in the Bronx. He was a street kid.
Well, he seems to have been a strong, as I remember seeing video clips of him, I know he was a strong proponent for, better health care, and certainly was complaining about the Republicans' answer. And I remember a famous quote of his of, the Republican solution is you get sick, you don't get health care, and you die. And that's how they solve the health care issue. So, no, I know exactly what you're talking about. And isn't it always great when you learn various people who are comic book people? And I certainly get a kick out of it when I hear not only celebrities, but also, again, Brad Meltzer, I forget which specific politician had Green Arrow in his office. And as he was getting started with his Green Arrow run, referred to, I believe he was a governor. And it certainly wasn't Jeb Bush. That's his local governor down in Florida. But no, that's great. And I wanted to know. So when you suggested these stories to Julie Schwartz, I'm assuming, and you guys were kind of putting more social justice in these stories, was there a concern? Was there like, hey, we don't want to, we're telling stories for 12-year-olds. Why, what are you doing putting these kinds of issues in stories?
I wondered the same thing. So I talked to Julie a lot for the last year of his life. I talked to him every Thursday morning. I was going in to teach a class, and he was coming in and would walk up and down the halls and stick his head in open doors and say, "What are you doing?" to editors. So I don't think Julie bothered to ask permission. I once asked him, well, the conventional wisdom in the 40s and 50s was you can't have continued stories because the newsstand distribution was so erratic that because I got Detective Party 5, that doesn't mean I will be able to get Detective Party 6.
Yes.
And yet he did a continued story once a year. And I said, how did you get away with that? And he said, I didn't ask. But nobody ever said anything. I think with Green Lantern and Green Arrow, he didn't see any need to share what we were doing with anyone. And so, the genesis of that was my paying my weekly visit to D.C., and I do a terrible Julie Schwartz little, well, my boy, what have you got? And it was a very avuncular editor. And I had done a couple of things, one of them for him with social concerns near the center of the story. And I wanted to do more. I was genuinely concerned with what was going on in the world. So he said that they wanted to, he personally, I think, wanted to continue publishing Green Lantern. The science fiction elements of it must have appealed to him.
Sure.
But the sales did not justify continued publication, so he pretty much gave me a blank slate. I told him an idea or two I had, and then I went home and wrote the story. And then I wrote another one and another one. And at that point, the first one was on the newsstand. And we got noticed by reporters. The first story that appeared was in the Village Voice, a counterculture newspaper from Greenwich Village that was on my must-reading list.
I hear you. Me too.
Yeah, it was founded by Norman Mailer in a bar I used to frequent. Anyway, I think that somebody at The Voice saw this and thought there might be a story there and called the number that was in the telephone book for DC Comics. Maybe got a receptionist or an assistant editor, somebody who didn't know what we were doing, because Julie wasn't mentioned in the Village Voice piece, nor was I, nor was Neil. And I think they didn't know what they were doing. That changed rapidly and drastically, and I found myself being interviewed by Parisian television. That was an experience not many people have had.
Wow.
And we got invited to universities, and we were suddenly respectable. But I think that came as a surprise to the people in the big office, because comic books, we don't have. I doubt that they read it. One of the real pluses in the Paul Levitt column is he did read this stuff, and he had opinions about it. But I don't think any of the executives bothered. And so this came as a surprise to them, but it came as a surprise that it came with an endorsement from the mayor of New York City, among other people. So they saw a bandwagon they could hop on, and that mayor eventually wrote a text piece for us. He was the last liberal Republican mayor in the United States.
Was that John Lindsay?
Lindsay, yeah.
John Lindsay, yeah. No, I remember.
Yeah.
And I've certainly seen my share of video of Mayor Lindsay and everything. And of course, kind of Batman television fans might know that there was a parody of him in the television show as well. Mayor Linseed, I believe, was how he was called. But you kind of, if you knew your history of politics, you knew who they were talking about back then. That's cool. And also, I remember your amazing issue of Green Lantern, Green Arrow, where clearly, as at least from an artist standpoint, it was Spiro Agnew in the story, and there was a little girl that had a face very much like Richard Nixon's face.
Yeah, and therein though lies another sore point, because I didn't know that cover was going to be done. The problem with it was that had nothing to do with the story. It had nothing to do with the continuity. You could certainly attack Agnew and Nixon, though at least one of my freelancers, who's a conservative, said he found it offensive.
Interesting.
But at the time, I thought it was so obvious that these guys are crooks and corrupt, there won't be any problem with this. Well, there are people who think that Nixon was a great president.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
I resented that, because what did it have to do with anything? It didn't make any political comment of its own, and it had nothing to do with the story.
Interesting.
Occasionally, Julie would let things get by that I couldn't understand why he did. That was an example. I don't know that I would have okayed that cover had I been editing the thing at the time.
Understood. No, I understand. I did want to ask you how you initially got the Batman writing job. And I don't know if we've ever talked about that. And I'm sure you've told the story a million times, but if you don't mind, I'd love to hear it.
No, I don't mind. I was working for Smile and Stanley as an editorial assistant, and then he fired me on what was probably the worst day of my life. I had a small baby, a child who was still being breastfed, and no money, and it was in the middle of a newspaper strike where my saleable skills were good on the market. And New York City, we didn't have any relatives, we didn't have any support system, and I didn't have any savings, and suddenly 10 o'clock of a weekday morning, I'm without a job. So I had socialized in the comic book world by then, and Steve Skates knew about Charlton Comics.
Yes.
And Dick Giordano came in once a week and sat in an office on Fifth Avenue that they rented. Empty room, really, with a desk and a couple of chairs, and he talked to the local freelancers. So I went up and I saw him on one of those days, and he gave me a job that I did pretty well. And then I did my first socially conscious story for him. It was called Children of Doom, and it was a pacifist-oriented story.
Jim Aparo drew that, am I right?
No, it was...
I thought he did.
It was a strange... I can't think of the guy's name. His day job was a cop.
Oh, Joe... Pete Morrissey.
Pete Morrissey, yeah. It was a hurry-up job. It had to be done in 4 days.
Oh, man. I love
So and Dick called me. He had something scheduled for that, and the rights to what they were going to publish fell through. I don't have any particulars. But he suddenly had a big hole in his schedule, and he needed something in a week, and it didn't make any difference what it was. So he called me and said, can you have me a script by Thursday? And I said, yeah, I guess. So I wrote that because it's what I wanted to write. And it went to artists who were also under terrible time pressure, but I think that worked for the work they did. I think the story came off well, because nobody had time to have any second thoughts about anything. There is something to be said for deadlines, and that's part of it right there. You don't have time to, stick your head up your ass and worry about things.
Agreed. Well, and I got to, for a second, as a tangent, I am fascinated by Pete Morrissey's work, both as a writer and an artist, because he was cranking out, it seemed like 75% of Charlton's output. And like you said, by day he was a cop, and by night he was writing these stories and drawing these stories. And I love Peter Cannon Thunderbolt, and I want to say Vengeance Squad was one of his throwaway Charlton things that, managed to, they cranked out maybe 6 issues. And just the whole, God, we could spend 2 hours just talking about Charlton and the powers that be in Derby, Connecticut, and why the comics were made and what their main business was. But that we'll do that another day. But so go on. So you're doing this sci-fi story for Charlton. So then for Dick,
and I'm doing a lot of stuff for Dick, and I was a model of reliability. I did not blow a deadline. Much later, Dick and I socially talked about that, and I was always afraid if I blow this deadline, I will never get another job from this editor, and maybe not from this genre. And Dick said he had the same problem. He was afraid to miss deadlines, so he never did. He got up at 5, worked till 8, and then took a train in to be a editor-in-chief. Anyway, after about a year of that, I walked in there one day and Dick said, how would you like to do exactly what you're doing now at 3 times the money? Okay, that was a very persuasive argument for a guy who had, at that time, Larry was maybe a year and a half old, and we were living in a ghetto, and Ann did not have saleable skills. She was a philosophy major. I'm very proud of her now because she's become an environmental activist.
Oh, wow.
But at the time, sure. And what had happened was Dick had been hired by DC, and part of the deal was he could bring some of his Charlton people with him. One of those was Steve Ditko. Skates and myself were the 2 writers. And So, yeah, suddenly I was getting $12 a page instead of $4 a page. Years and years later, I got the whole story. I didn't know at the time, and thank God. But I was writing a text piece for Superman's 50th anniversary for a hardcover publisher in the Midwest. And one of the people I interviewed was Paul Levitz, who told me how I came to work for DC Comics. I don't know what Steve was thinking about, and I haven't seen him in years. But I was thinking, well, these people at DC saw the great work that we're doing for Charlton and decided that they would bring us aboard. No, that wasn't even close to what happened. What happened was the guys who created comic books, Gary Robinson was one of them, and, that bunch of names that you occasionally saw in the comics. It was after the war. Most of them had been veterans. They were solid citizens. They had families. They had mortgages. They were eminently decent citizens. And they asked the company for a little help with health insurance. They weren't threatening job actions or anything, just hat in hand kind, can we please have some help with this? The company's response was to fire them. All.
Yeah.
And Skates and I were warm bodies. We could type. That's all they knew about or cared about. So when Paul told me that story, I said, "You realize I'm interviewing you in a role as a journalist, and you just told me something that makes a company look really bad." And he said, "No, put it in print because it'll tell everybody how far we've come."
Wow.
Well, we've come much further than that since I wrote that piece. But I came to work for DC not because of any virtue I had as either a professional or as a writer, because I needed warm bodies.
Wow.
It was as simple as that.
Jeez. And I know,
That was the comic book business then, and to some degree that was the TV business. Writers were going to get screwed.
Yeah. Jeez. Yeah, and
And we never did what TV and movie people did, was put together a really good union. I still get mailings from them, and I've been a member emeritus for about 10 years. But anytime anything of mine is shown at 3 a.m. in Addis Ababa, they will see that I get whatever money is coming.
That's great, man. No, I understand the Writers Guild, and certainly about 10 years ago when the idea of Netflix and streaming TV was just getting started, and even the DVD re-releases of television and film, I'm glad the Writers Guild was able to step up and, get better compensation. I don't know if, as usual with a union and bosses compromise, nobody gets everything they really want. But I'm assuming that it's gotten better, and certainly, well, yeah, you know better, I think.
Well, Roy and Jerry have a story to tell, which pretty much illustrates what you've been saying. They wrote the last Conan movie, and they took it in, and they pitched their story to Dino De Laurentiis, and he allowed us how, yeah, that was a good Conan story. They would get the job. What he did was give it to a writer he had under contract. That guy did the actual shooting script using Jerry and Roy's story, and Jerry and Roy got nothing.
Wow.
And the other guy's name went on. That was very common. It was even done in comic books. In the Superman office, I didn't have any first-hand experience with it, but you heard stories. And that editor was considered his mentor, which I find interesting. But
was that more Weisinger? Forgive me for putting a name on it.
Yeah, I would rather not use proper names, but yeah.
Okay, all right. I understand.
And he wasn't the only one. There was one guy who at Christmas time, gave to all of his freelancers copies of his suit and shirt and shoe and necktie preferences. So the idea was, you're going to give me an expensive Christmas gift.
Wow. Oh, my God.
Whatever Jim Shooter's problems were with him, it was exactly the opposite. He gave us nice gifts.
Well, that's good. I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah.
Now, we mentioned a couple names, and actually, while we're talking about him, when you went to Marvel, what was that? What was the impetus for you leaving DC and going to Marvel?
I was writing a book on the history of comics for Scholastic Press, and I interviewed everybody I could think of to interview. One of them was Jim Shooter, who was brand new at that job, and he offered me, a job. Now, at that point, I was writing a lot, and I thought I was up to my capacity. I couldn't do any more without compromising the work. I don't know if that was true or not. We'll never know. But I was looking for some way to earn a living that did not depend on talent, but on, thinking about things. Obviously, editorial work was that. I went to my bosses at DC and presented them with the problem. I got a kid who's starting school. I have expenses I didn't used to have. Their answer was to give me more writing work. Jim Shooter's answer was to give me a writer-editor deal and a raise. So, of course, with apologies to DC, I took the offer. And for 2 years, he was the best boss I ever had. And I also had as an assistant Mark Grunwald.
Oh, wow. Sure.
Who was an enormous benefit to the comic book world.
Amen. Absolutely, man. Great writer. Absolutely.
He's gone 20 years now.
Wow.
Hard to believe.
I know. Jeez, man. Oof. So, you said, all right, so were you only at Marvel for those 2 years, or did things change? Did Jim leave and then you had other...
No, I stayed. I think I worked as a Marvel editor for 7 years.
Okay, yeah, that makes more sense.
Toward the end, though, things were getting very uncomfortable, and I sensed that Shooter was not happy with me, and I didn't know why. The frustrating part was the thing I worked at hardest was figuring out ways to please him. So I would occasionally go to his office after hours, and I'd say, I think you're unhappy with me. What can I do? Finally, Dick made his offer, and I kept stalling him. And then finally, I decided I'd be a fool not to accept Shooter's job. So I remember I went out running through Lower Manhattan that day. I was trying to run about 5 miles a day at the time. And I got back and there was a phone call. Anyway, I was hired by Shooter, who said that There Is No Hope in Crime Alley was one of the best comic book stories, and it was one of his favorites, and I was the writer. And after a year of writing Spider-Man, I got fired off that. I took over Iron Man. This is another thing I learned years later. Jim did not like my Iron Man.
Interesting.
It was getting praise from the world, but not from him, and he tried to get Mark to fire me. And Mark stood up for me and put his own job in jeopardy once a month by refusing to do that.
Wow.
And refusing to edit the stories to make them more what other people thought they ought to be. I did not have a whisper of any of that until Mike Carlin told me years later. He was Mark's assistant at the time.
Okay.
I got to know Mark really well after that, but he was he was a creative guy's editor, and eventually I kept getting calls from Dick Giordano saying, "Why, have you decided to come to work for me yet?" And I was having a tough time with Jim, so I went to his boss and said, "I've been offered a job at DC, and right now I'm thinking of taking it. Would you like to react to that?" And he said, "Is the problem your boss?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Okay, you and I and he will have," this was a Monday, "lunch on Thursday. I will make peace between you guys because we don't want to lose you." So Tuesday we had a day-long editorial conference. Wednesday I went into work and Shooter walked into my office at 10 and said, "We have to part company." He was firing me. I said, "Okay, what reason are you going to give the world for this action you're taking?" He said, "Well, we asked Byrne to change something, and it was Jim's idea, not mine, and I didn't take credit or blame for it. And in Jim's opinion, I should have." So I said, "Yeah, that's true. I didn't agree with the change, and I didn't tell John that it was mine." So I took leave, and then I called Dick and said, "I'm ready to go to work for you." He said, "Well, you waited too long. We hired somebody else."
Jesus.
So for 3 weeks, I was freelance.
Oh, my God.
That was my goal that they hired.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Then right after New Year's, right after the holidays, I got a call from Dick saying, "You start work on Monday afternoon, be here by 12, and welcome aboard."
Wow. Honestly, man, hearing these things, it's amazing. And again, I was reading the fan magazines back then, Amazing Heroes and Comics Interview and Comics Journal and everything. And yeah, those were our news sources. When you were doing your interviews for Scholastic, I'm curious, this opens a new question. Did you tape record them? Did you, I mean, obviously I know you're a journalist and I'm sure you're used to just doing an interview with a notepad, but how did you transcribe these interviews?
Oh, I was very conscientious, so I did tape record everything. I mean, the best job I had at that period as a magazine writer was interviewing Alfred Bester.
Wow.
It was the best afternoon I ever had working.
Yeah.
He was at a party. I was kind of social back then, and there was a party in Greenwich Village, and I was a kind of village guy, so I went, and that was Alfred Bester standing across the room. I can't go talk to him. He is a god. He is my favorite science fiction writer, so I didn't talk to him, but Roy gave me an assignment to interview him for their black and white SF magazine a week later. And he was living on like 60th and Madison. And he was everything you want a writer to be if you don't know any writers. Funny, kind, erudite, full of lots and lots of information. Yeah, come in. And, I had a couple of run-ins with him later, but that was just an absolutely flat-out wonderful afternoon. I don't know how I got off on that, but that was.
Go on. Yeah.
I still like doing journalism because it was such a nice change from doing comics.
I understand.
So I didn't refuse any of those kind of jobs. I didn't refuse the offer to write a book for Scholastic.
Did you hang on to those tapes? Or did you, after it was done?
No, God knows where they went. I have moved about 14
Sure.
times since then. And one of the reasons I'm not moving out of this house, although I'm now living here alone, is there are so goddamn many books and tapes and videos and courses and thousands of comic books.
Sure, I bet.
It's going to be a nightmare for whoever gets stuck doing that after I cash in my chips. If that's how I cash in my chips.
I understand.
I've been dead once, and
you were
nothing to it.
You were dead once, you say?
Yeah, about 15 years ago, I was having lunch with Mia Wolf. Probably you don't know the name. She has a connection to comics. But we were, and her 12-year-old son, Virgil, were in a Mexican restaurant in a nearby town. And according to Mia, I was talking about I don't believe in an afterlife. And she said that you fell off the chair. And I thought you were trying to be funny.
Oh, my God.
So I didn't do anything. And after a couple of minutes, I looked over and you had turned green. So
Wow.
she yelled for help. The guy who owned the restaurant was also a fireman. So he knew where there was a defibrillator next door in City Hall. He got that on the third try. He got my heart beating. I was clinically dead for 5 to 10 minutes,
Wow.
I guess.
Jesus.
Nobody was keeping track. And by that time, the medics had arrived, and they had great toys for bringing me back to life. So they did. And I went to hospitals and then had open heart surgery about a week later.
Wow. I do remember I remember when you were recovering from your heart surgery. Wow. Oh, my. Denny,
Yeah, now all 4 of my brothers have had the same operation. It's obviously genetics.
Jeez, man. Well, all these near-death experiences that you've had. This is incredible. I'm glad you made it to the other, that you're able to walk away from them. I'm sure slowly, but I'm glad that, geez, I don't know what else to say. That's insane. And I'm sorry.
Well, I can say that on the plus side, I have not had a dull or boring life. And I'm really grateful for that. I'm really grateful for the last 15 years of being a comic book editor because, gee whiz, Mary Fran and I went to fucking Australia, for heaven's sake.
Fantastic.
I would never have even thought to go there. We got introduced to the president of Chile. We had lunch in the Senate dining room. It's been such an interesting life. DC, the Time Warner stayed out of my face except for that one story I told you where I had to bring Batman back to life prematurely.
Right.
But I worked with great people. I had the best toy you could give a storyteller. Batman is a great storytelling tool, and I could pretty much tell the stories I wanted to tell. It was a great gift to give to somebody whose primary mission in life has been telling stories. So yeah, it has been a tough life here and there, but I wouldn't change a second of it.
I understand.
Because, wow,
Yeah.
what a great, and toward the end, there was money attached. When I went to work in comics, I was making enough to cover expenses, rent and food. Toward the end, we had royalties. We had ancillary payments. It got to be a very good job as jobs go. It was hard sometimes. There were bad weeks, bad months. But that's true of any job.
Sure.
I didn't work anywhere near as hard as my father did running a grocery store.
Understood. My dad ran a restaurant. I totally understand, and I feel the same way. And no, and again, that's great and not surprising because again, your body of work has been beloved for all these decades. And again, what you put into Batman in particular, yeah, I mean, again, they're all following in your footsteps, Denny, and I say that because it's true. And also, I'm interested when you came back, and also after you got sober. Am I right in the time frame? You wrote Venom, the original Legends of the Dark Knight story that introduced the drug that later became the basis for Bane.
Yeah.
But that story of Bruce Wayne really kind of finding this way to at least initially think, oh my God, this is an improvement. I can be a better Batman through the help of chemicals. Tell me about that story and how.
Well, I would not have written it if I hadn't had my own experience with alcoholism. But the genesis of the story was my waking up one day and realizing nobody ever takes the first drink thinking, well, I'm going to completely fuck up my life. I'm going to ruin my marriage. I'm going to lose my job. I'm going to end up in a gutter. Yeah, that's my agenda. I couldn't talk to girls sober. I mean, alcohol allowed me to go to parties and ask girls for dates for a long time. It was a very useful social tool. Now, there comes the day when a corner is turned and suddenly it's not a tool anymore, it's something you have to have. Then you've got problems, and you never know. Annie, my wife, matched me drink for drink back then, but she didn't have to have it. When it was appropriate to stop drinking, she stopped. When it was appropriate to stop drinking, I continued until the bottle was empty. Yeah. So you never know ahead of time. Both sides of the family are riddled with bad alcoholics. I didn't know that. So one of the things I told my son early on was I did an 8th step with him. You're supposed to talk to the people who were harmed by your drinking and confess your sins to them. And I figured the two people most harmed were Jeannie Thomas and Larry O'Neill, and I talked to both of them.
Wow.
And that's a good strategy. You face the demons. But the genesis of that story was exactly that. If I take this drug, whatever it is, I can be a better version of what I am. And it's true for a while, usually. Then comes the bad times.
No, it was an incredible story. It's really, I think, a very powerful one, and I love the evolution of this storytelling, and I wanted to know your opinion of this, if this was a conscious decision, because the prior decades to when you guys started being more socially aware, but also really getting into character, I really think obviously just elevated the whole comic book medium as far as the superhero genre goes, because now we were seeing the flaws in these characters. And, Dave Michelini did it with Iron Man, with Demon in a Bottle. Or
I owe Dave for that.
And that's, I mean, those kinds of moves. And certainly Venom is a great personal Bruce story where he had, I just think that's great, rather than smash through the wall, like my Superman trope. And don't get me wrong, it still works. But that classic, like, George Reeves moment, he crashes through the wall, the gangsters shoot at him, bullets bounce off, he clunks their heads, and he flies them off to jail, and that's the end of the story, or the Batman equivalent. And it's like, no, you appreciate when they have doubts. Frank did it as well, Miller in Dark Knight Returns, and these characters become more three-dimensional. So was that one of your goals as you were writing comics, even going back to, those times in the 70s?
Well, here's the big advantage I had that my predecessors didn't. I went into it after Stan Lee created Marvel, and what he did to create Marvel, as much as anything, was to change the writing. Everybody was still in the shadow of Frederick Wertham, and comic book guys were afraid to even use slang. Stan pretty deliberately decided to ignore that stuff. He wrote witty, self-deprecating, self-satirical stories. I was, by that time, a Navy veteran, and I taught in ghetto schools, and I thought of myself as pretty sophisticated. But Stan's approach gave me permission. He's not taking it seriously, therefore I can read this because I won't take it seriously either. I think what I was really responding to was the stories. But my excuse was, well, he's got these witty captions that are making fun of the whole Marvel thing. So, yeah. So I had that going for me, that Stan had found a new way to approach the writing of comic book stories. And at about the same time, Julie Schwartz had reinvented the other half of it, the half that does with origin stories and plots. He called on his science fiction background. It served him well. And between the two of them, they reinvented superheroes within a year or so of each other. So I came in, as did Roy and Steve, without any need to pay a lot of attention to a lot of stupid rules that really didn't serve any purpose. And it was okay for me to do characters because Stan was doing characters. He had, opened the path. And it didn't occur to me not to write the stories as wittily as I could.
Well, that's good. I mean, again, it blew my little mind, as a 10-year-old something, and then into my tween years in the early 70s, and always really appreciated your writing, Carrie Bates' writing, Marty Pasco, and
Carrie was the great unsung hero. I mean, for 11 years, he found a new way to use super speed. That alone would put him in my pantheon.
Agreed. And I always loved his Superman stories too. I always felt he really had a great handle on telling great Superman stories, and Elliot Magan as well. And I know he's one of your disciples, and certainly followed your example with Green Arrow years after your guys' run. I really, you guys were my original storytellers, and truly I followed your stuff very carefully and appreciated what you guys were doing, and felt like, again, I was reading important stories. When I read the 100-page spectaculars or 80-page giants, and they would have the reprints of the older stuff, I still appreciated those because I think I was young enough to still do it, and I'm glad I read those.
Well, yeah, they were what they were. It's been a long and fairly fast evolution from people who had done nothing but write pulp stories suddenly are doing comic books, and they don't. I think Jerry Schuster, Joe Siegel, and Bill Finger had a sense of what a comic book was, what this kind of narration was. But most of the guys were really making it up as they went along, and it wasn't supposed to be good. Because the bosses had no respect for, the work that was being done. They got real rich because of that work, but they didn't find any need to share any of that. Health insurance? No, you're fired.
Yeah. Jeez. How about Jeanette Kahn when she came over? Did you have many interactions?
Well, she was a breath of fresh air. She was her predecessor was a guy who was not, even though he would deny this now, was not a businessman, and he got the job as the big boss, I think because what became Time Warner bought the company, and they didn't know anything about it, but they had flow charts and that sort of thing. And on paper, he was the highest ranking member of the editorial department. So he kind of got the job, I think, that way. There's a lot of gossip that went around about the particulars of that. I'm not going to retail any of that because I have no reason to believe it's true.
Okay.
But he walked into his office one day and he was escorted out of the building by security guys. I have never found out why. But it was not just getting fired, because that happened fairly often. And it was not that unusual. But he was not allowed to take anything out of his office, as far as I know. I know for a certainty he was escorted onto the street by uniformed guys. And then here comes Jeanette Kahn, 23 years old. Rabbi's daughter had started 2 successful children's magazines already in her young life, and they gave her the job. And she learned on the job, but she was, well, the name of the company was National Periodicals Publications. And as Tom Wolfe once said about the New York Times Magazine, you think water buffaloes on the cover and those stories and your weekly dose of boredom. And along comes Jeanette and says, we shouldn't hide the fact that we do comics. We should advertise it. So she had a jacket made for herself. At that time, Superman, the movie, was in the air. Jeanette's jacket said Superman, the comic book, on the back of it. And I think she made mistakes, as anybody would, coming into a totally alien job. But she made us happy with what we did. She tried to give us a sense of pride. She tried to bring this antiquated publishing venue into the 20th century. I think she was much more on the plus side than on the minus side. I think she now lives just a few blocks from my kid. My kid just moved to Harlem. And Jeanette has lived there about 10 years now.
That's awesome. I'm really glad. It seems like in the last couple of years, people are learning more about her story and that she is getting her due for changing things. And I'll tell you, man, again, that was in the midst of my reading, and you felt the creative energy. And I also read her original children's magazines, Dynamite, and I think Pizzazz was the other one. Mm-hmm. And yeah, those were coming to us in grade school through Scholastic, and they were great. And it doesn't surprise me. It is amazing to learn that she was 23 and taking over DC Comics. Yeah. That's really incredible. My God.
Yeah. She has now got her name on movie credits. And I occasionally run into her, very rarely. It's always a very cordial, pleasant meeting.
That's cool.
She has aged, but haven't we all?
Sure. I understand. Absolutely. Well, again, this is, 40, really, I guess more than 40 years since she took over. Holy cow. Crazy.
Yeah.
And honestly, I appreciate your time. I wondered if you had any thoughts on, we lost a couple big, geek culture icons, and Steve Ditko, you mentioned him earlier, and I know Charlton was the kind of business that likely freelancers didn't necessarily run into each other, but I wondered if you had any Steve Ditko memories or encounters that you wanted to share.
Well, I did not offer to eulogize Steve, though I had great respect for him. I mean, I am occasionally called on to do that, and it's generally something I'm happy to do. But we just so disagreed on so many things.
Sure.
I feel guilty about Steve, and I'll tell you why. Twice I took over characters that he created and changed them drastically, changed them into things that he can't possibly have liked. Well, with the question, when Levitz asked me to do it, I said, I can't write what I can't do the kind of stories Steve is doing. And he said, do the kind of stories you feel like doing. Well, that was kind of a slap in the face to Steve, though I didn't realize it. And Lenny Ween eventually said, you were going to change it that much. Why didn't you simply create your own character?
Interesting.
It's a good question.
Wow, interesting. Yeah.
The answer was that, well, I was used to doing assignments. This was something that the president of the company assigned to me. And so I did it, as I had been doing for 40 years. But Steve was one of those vehement Ayn Rand people. Yes. I came back from one of the marches on the Pentagon, and I happened to run into him in the office the next day, and he was talking about how those hippies should have been machine guns, and I'm thinking, whoa, I'd have been right in the line of fire.
Wow, yeah.
But that's a problem I have with conservatives of any kind. It's always about violence.
Understood, yeah.
On the other hand, the progressives and liberals don't seem to know what they're doing. So
I share your frustration and do understand. And frankly, we did talk about 12 years ago in our first conversation about how you changed the question. But you did put it in the book that he had his near-death experience and came out of it a changed man. And I can also, did you ever have an opportunity to see him after you started your run, and did you ever exchange words in you know what you were doing with the character?
No, he was not a sociable man. He pretty much stuck to, well, my dominant emotion about him, I guess, is pity, because he seemed to be so lonely and so isolated. He had his little cramped studio on 8th Avenue, and I think he lived mostly in a hotel.
Wow.
And was vehement about the Ayn Rand stuff.
Yeah.
Mr. A, yes. There is no gray. There's only black and white. Those people remind me of evangelical Christians. I'm right. There's no point in arguing this. I'm right, and you should die if you don't agree with me.
Wow. Yeah. Jeez. And how about Harlan Ellison? And another pointy man, but man, I loved his stories. And also, you know, as passionate as he was about his points of view, you could never, you know, he was never not entertaining, at the very least.
He was a miraculously good speaker. I once saw him hold an audience of 3,000 people from midnight till 3 a.m. while a projector got fixed at a convention. The movie to be shown was The Boy and His Dog. Yeah, I've wondered about Harlan. I saw him in Atlanta about 5 years ago, and he gave me the Julie Schwartz Lifetime Achievement Award. It was very kind of cool to get that from Harlan. And I hadn't spoken to him for 10 years, and I didn't know what the problem was, if any, but he ran across the stage when they read out my name as the winner of this award and told the audience, I haven't seen Denny, talked to Denny in 10 years. And I'm thinking, yeah, it's because you disappeared. But he hugged me, and the next day he went out of his way to make sure that I got the seat next to his on the panel about Julie that we did. And I guess we were pretty close friends at one point. When I needed work, he got it for me. Get out here in 48 hours, you can probably write a TV show. And I got out there in 48 hours and wrote the show.
Wow.
He's a man who I think is not inconsiderable talent as a writer was compromised by his great talent as a stand-up comedian. Because he could get instant gratification that way. Writing is a slow process, as I'm sure you know. And there's a part of you that has to want to close that door behind you for 20 to 30 hours a week. The last writing I know that Harlan did was in public, in a Fifth Avenue bookstore window.
Yes. Go on. Yes.
And he did something similar in Los Angeles. Well, that's okay. I really try hard not to be judgmental anymore. One of my great faults. But that's kind of showing off more than writing. And if you need that kind of stimulation, you have a problem you have to look at. Not pretend that's not there.
Very interesting. Yeah. Now,
so he until about age 35, he was super talent. Also a very good guy to get along with. He was a very good guy to hang out with. Very generous to me in that when I went out to write that CBS show, he had a secret room in his house that you got to by knowing which books on a bookshelf to move. And then it opened, and that was my bedroom for the time it took me to do that CBS
That's
job.
Hilarious. A secret panel led to your bedroom at Harlan's house. I've heard about that secret panel in that room. That's amazing. Denny, I didn't know you wrote television, and can you tell us some of the shows you wrote for?
Well, that one was Logan's Run.
Oh,
it never got broadcast because the show got canceled. I wrote episode 13.
Okay.
The show got canceled after about 10 episodes.
Yeah, I remember as a kid watching the television version of Logan's Run. Sure.
But I got suddenly had a semi-wide hole in my schedule. I had nothing to write. I had no work to do. So I called Harlan, and I just quoted him a little while ago. If you can get out here in 48 hours, it's not too late to get a job. So he lent me his car, and one Sunday morning, or one weekday morning, I went to a movie studio, and I talked to the woman who had been the story editor on Star Trek, and the producer, and I walked out of there with an assignment. And all due to Harlan's generosity.
Wow. Was that D.C. Fontana? Okay. Yeah.
The backstory on that is that when I was kind of a hippie in St. Louis, I and two young women and a friend of mine who was in law school at the time rented a house and, went chipped in on the necessary things. And we were, if there was such a thing as a hippie in St. Louis at the time, we were probably it. And this guy named Mike Ayler passed through town. He was a wandering intellectual, and when we were talking about books with him, he said, "Well, listen, you want to know a writer, Harlan Ellison. He lays the truth on you so that you can't stand it. And here's Mike Ayler talking about this guy we never heard of." So we got in my brother's car, and we went to the airport because I knew their bookstore would be open, and Harlan had a book out, and we all got it. So I knew who he was before I got to New York.
Interesting.
And one of the first parties we went to, Annie, my wife, was and I guess is quite beautiful. And so we were at a party, and Harlan hit on her, and she said, "No, I'm married." And he said, "Well, that's all right. Let's get out of here." And she said, "No, my Denny O'Neill is my husband." Well, I had exchanged letters with Harlan at that point. He said, "Oh, okay. Well, introduce me to Denny." And, we kind of stayed in touch after that.
That's amazing. That's fantastic. Jesus. Too much, man. I
worry about him a little bit because I haven't heard anything about him for about 5 years. And Harlan was a guy that if he was in town, you knew it.
I understand.
The young woman I'm having a phone conversation with tomorrow I was gonna meet Harlan for dinner, and a bunch of other people were coming, and I was hanging around with Carol. So I said, why don't you come to dinner? So New York City was in the middle of a blizzard, and I was an hour late getting to the apartment that Harlan was in. So for that hour, Harlan had nothing to do at all but let Carol have both barrels of the charm. By the time I got her, this educated, intellectual, funny woman was totally in his pocket.
I understand, man. No, and as you say, quite a storyteller and quite a charmer all the way. And I loved when he was on the Sci-Fi Channel doing his little commentaries about what was going on in everything. I mean, I remember him commenting on when Marvel was near bankruptcy, and he was really just devastated by it. And we're not going to. Marvel might end up, who knows? DC might end up getting these characters, and his speculation of what might happen at that point in the late '90s. It was always interesting to hear his point of view.
Yeah, comic books were a gift to him, I think, because it gave him a venue. I don't know why he didn't stick closer to science fiction, because they loved him too, but he became part of the comic book world, and for years DC sent him, as they did me, everything they published. They stopped doing that a couple of years ago.
Yes.
But his house was amazing. If you could just get an hour in Ellison's joint. There was a lot of corners, and around every corner was something you didn't expect to see.
That's amazing. That's great.
A poster or a movie prop or something. And he had, of course, thousands of books and a very extensive comic book collection and a secret panel.
Absolutely, man. Too much. Last time we spoke, you said you were working on a current Batman project. And by the way, if this is something you don't want to tease, we can. I'll stop and we can edit this. But I was curious, and I assume they're going to release it next year for the 80th anniversary of Batman.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of stuff coming up. The 1000th issue of Detective, and Batman shortly thereafter. Yeah, no, I don't mind talking about what I did. I wrote a sequel to There Is No Open Crime Alley, but because the business has loosened up a lot, I got a chance to really write the story you might want to write. Batman is a jerk in this, and without Leslie, he would have done something he could never have forgiven himself for. All in the cause of violence on the side of righteousness. So the kid who edited it said the little speech I gave Leslie about you think you're fighting, you're working against violence, you're actually promoting it because you can't solve a problem without hurting someone. Those are things I might have put in the first story, and I didn't think I'd get away with them then. But I did now. I'm very happy with them. It's probably happier with that and the Christmas story than any comic book work I've done in years. We should also say something about my poor forlorn novel.
Yes, of course.
It's out there, I'm told. I have not as yet signed an autograph, but I have not ventured very far from this house. I'm debating whether or not to give a copy to Carol tomorrow. I don't give away my stuff, but there were two kids who came to the front door, and they knew my address, and they just called to say hello to me because they were comics fans. Just out of nowhere. Yeah, so I gave them a copy of. So we should say that this is a novel that is about 30% autobiographical and is largely about comic books changed from a backwater disreputable trash genre to something that is taught in most of the major universities in the country. And you can get it from Amazon. Of course, you can get anything from Amazon. But I didn't take any ads out, and everybody told me, including Chuck Dixon, who's had a lot of success doing Amazon publishing, that you have to promote it.
Well, it's called the Perils of Captain Mighty and the Redemption of Danny the Kid. I've got it on my tablet. You and Larry were kind to send me the PDF of it, and no, it's great, Denny. And again, we spoke about it a few months ago, but I'm glad to mention it again, and also the fact that, as you say, you're going to have a handful of copies when you go to Terrificon next month in Connecticut. So a few people will be able to get it there, but it's on Amazon, and you can pick it up as well digitally. And yeah, it's an incredible story, and it's a very personal story. And I am, again, as you said earlier, it maybe went in a direction you weren't planning on going into, but I think it only makes you a much more interesting person to learn a lot of your backstory in this book.
Well, thank you, John. That's very nice of you.
Truly, I appreciate it, Danny, and I'm really looking forward to seeing you next month. And I will let you and Larry know when I put this out. But thank you very much for your time. I really, really appreciate it.
You bet.
So those are all the word balloon words I have of Denny O'Neil. There's going to be more words shared tonight, Sunday night. It'll be at 11 o'clock Eastern, 10 o'clock Central, 8 p.m. Pacific. I'll be talking to Greg Rucka about Denny's career. Greg was brought into writing comics by Denny O'Neil. And I'm going to let Greg tell his stories about Denny, and we'll talk more about his career and take your questions as well on a Word Balloon Live video conversation happening Sunday night. It will be a podcast as well on Monday morning. Thanks a lot for listening today. More Word Balloon conversations coming in the weeks ahead, as I always say, but happy to take a moment and think about Denny O'Neil this weekend. Believe me, he's been on my mind all weekend, as I'm sure he's been on all of your minds as well. Until next time, thanks for listening. Word Balloon is a copyright feature of Shaky Productions. Copyright 2020. Stay safe, stay happy, stay healthy.